Okay, May 40 here. So Donald Trump maintains momentum in the 2024 American presidential race. He seems to be doing well in the battleground states. We're starting to get a clearer picture of early voting returns and nothing yet to panic Republicans, though we have to stay in reality, admit that Democrats do have the stronger ground game. Why is Kamala Harris so dramatically changing her media strategy? The explanation that makes the most sense is that she recognizes that she is losing. Now, there was a Trump aide who made an excuse for why Donald Trump canceled a particular interview, and the aide said that he was exhausted. And this became a major talking point for the Kamala Harris campaign and for the news media. And Donald Trump does show signs of exhaustion at times, but overall, the guy has an incredible level of vitality for someone who is 78 years of age. Now that Joe Biden is no longer in the race and Donald Trump is the oldest candidate in the race, then suddenly the age of the candidate and his mental capacities are a key concern for the news media. So they covered up for Joe Biden's senility for years. Now they're putting the focus on Donald Trump. And so the stray remark that Donald Trump is exhausted, it played into the media focus that Donald Trump is unfit for office, and they're looking for all sorts of different examples, hoping to find one that will land with swing voters on why Donald Trump is unfit for office. And the latest explanation is that he's simply too tired. He's just too exhausted to campaign adequately, and this shows that he will be unfit for office. Kamala Harris has pivoted back to Joe Biden's primary attack, that Donald Trump was unfit for office. That was the primary reason that Joe Biden said people should reelect him in 2024. Now, Kamala Harris's message is very similar to Joe Biden's message, but the messenger is different. And so sometimes you can have an identical message, and when it's delivered by one person, it's not going to land. But when it's delivered by a different messenger, it will land. So the Dispatch is a Never Trump group of Republicans led by Jonah Goldberg and Sarah Isgur, former Trump campaign aide. Let's play some of their latest discussion.
I'm not sure, except insofar as to say, I think I was talking to a prominent.
So the question was, why did Kamala Harris change her media strategy?
Democratic strategist type person recently. And they said when they heard that she was going to do Bret Baier, she said, okay, they think they're losing. And when you think you're losing, you got to take risks. You got to shake things up. You got to change the narrative. And so I kind of think that that's part of it. It seems to me that the Harris people have, I mean, you can just pretty much figure out what voters they're going for based upon the places they go. I mean, like they didn't go to get they didn't do Charlemagne the God show, which I hate having to say that name. I despise it. But they didn't do that to go pick up the ethnic Polish Catholic vote, right? I mean, like, you know what they were going for there. And
100% agree with Jonah Goldberg that having to say the name Charlemagne the God is incredibly obnoxious. Like, what level of megalomania would lead someone to call himself the God? And the radio talk show host says that he just liked the sound of it. Now, this level of megalomania is fairly common in certain sectors of America and is incredibly distasteful to the overwhelming majority of Americans.
The thing that's more interesting, and you know what they're going for with The View. The thing that's interesting about the Bret Baier thing is I think that was less about going after persuadable Republicans, although that's probably some of it, but also as a sort of get out the vote effort for their own base. She went into the Lion's Den. It gives them the sense that, you know, it reassures them that she's not scared, that she's tough. It gives them a talking point against Trump and that kind of thing. And I think their risk reward on it was that even if it went badly, negative partisanship would rally around her. And I think it has a little bit. But beyond that, I don't know. I mean, I think the TikTok after the election of what the thinking inside the campaign was on various things is going to be fascinating.
So, Declan, there were plenty of conversations that she's going on Fox News to reach, basically Dispatchian conservatives, people who are, Fox News consumers, but who feel deeply uncomfortable with Trump and are open to voting for her. Was that her audience?
I think Jonah is correct that it's much more of a process argument that she was hoping to make for weeks now. Harris and Harris allies and the Harris campaign has been trying to make the case that we need another debate. We need to press Trump on his policies more. And this is a way. You can't really call Trump a chicken or a coward for not doing another debate if you're not willing to answer tough questions yourself. And so it's more of a box checking exercise. I went on Fox. I answered tough questions. Why won't Donald Trump? Now she can make that case a little bit more rigorously. I was interested to see, and listening to this interview, she went on Fox and theoretically is talking to those voters, potential disaffected Republican crossovers. She did not mention by name Liz Cheney, the types of people, because even though they are quote unquote Republicans who are supporting her, they are kind of persona non grata with most Fox viewers at this point. So you have to, I think she used Mark Milley as kind of a proxy for that kind of, even Trump's defense secretary or his joint chiefs of staff aren't supporting him, but she's not actually talking. She can't be like, well, Adam Kinzinger is supporting me, because that's not going to do anything for Fox voters who have kind of been led to view those kinds of Republicans in certain ways. And so it's a difficult tightrope for her to walk, where she has the support of nominally called Republicans who Fox viewers do not view as Republicans, including the former Vice President of the United States. And he has not endorsed
who she
but
did mention.
Yes.
She did mention him in the interview. Okay, Megan, there's a reverse version of this, which is actually the reason that you go on Fox News is a base play. You're trying to make your base defensive of you. So you go on the most aggressive interview you can find, and it will anger your base that you're treated hostilely, that these, horrible people dare to question you type thing. Now, that comes with a bit of a risk when you do that, because, of course, the reverse is also true if you make a base play, that Trump supporters will see you on their home turf, and it will remind them how much they hate you and motivate them to turn out as well. So a bit of a high wire act, but basically the idea is you go on Fox News because it's a get out the vote mechanism for your own team.
Yeah, I think that's right. But first of all, I will say, I think the whole get out the base service theory of winning elections that Democrats have been endorsing for more than a decade now is just wrong. It has objectively failed. I mean, I'm not saying that they don't win when their base turns out.
So one of the weakest anti-Trump talking points, in my view, is this idea that Trump is some kind of embodiment of fascism. Now, I think it's intellectually weak argument. Now, whether it's a political winner is, of course, a different question. I don't believe it's a political winner because it doesn't have anything to do with most people's real concerns, right? For people who don't own a home and are not heavily invested in the stock market, the 3.5 years under Joe Biden have been bad for their living standards. And this is a primary area of concern, not whether or not Trump embodies fascism. If you want to see fascism, you can find fascism everywhere. I'm thinking about a fictional character, all right, a Dink Stover, right? He is the lead character of a novel, Stover at Yale, that was published in 1911. And here he describes the Yale University education process, and it just sounds like fascism if you're inclined to see things through the lens of fascism. Right, so Dink Stover was introduced to Yale democracy, and he suddenly realized that the stern discipline of it all, unnecessary, and stamping out individuality seemed to him at first, but subordinating everything to one purpose, eliminating the individual factor. If you want to read fascism, all right, you're going to read fascism into this, demanding absolute subordination to the whole, submerging everything into the machine, right? This is a novel talking about the process at Yale, and this was similar at many other elite universities. So there are corporations such as IBM that produce corporation men, and there have been educational institutions focused on turning out a particular type of individual, and the way that they make this impact is by reducing the individuality factor. And you can look at this and say, oh my God, that's fascism. It's not fascism. Fascism was an ideology that arose in a particular time and place in response to the challenge of authoritarian, totalitarian communism. And so fascism arose in Italy and perhaps also in Germany. Fascism is not inherently racist. So the racism of German Nazi ideology, one can argue, goes against fascism. But demanding absolute subordination to the whole, submerging everything into the machine, you have all sorts of groups with this mentality, and it doesn't make them fascist. This was not a machine only when once accomplished, but an immense idea of sacrifice and self-abnegation, directly, clearly visualized. He perceived for the first time what he was to perceive in every side of his college career, that a standard had been fashioned to which, irresistibly, subtly, he would have to conform. So this is often a winning formula for businesses, for religious organizations, for all sorts of in-groups, for a football team. Right? Subordinating the individual to the needs of the group is often a winning strategy. In other contexts, it's a losing strategy. If you want to read fascism into it, you can, but if you want to have fidelity to the truth, fascism was an ideology that arose at a particular time in history, 1930s into the 40s, at a particular place, Central Europe, in response to a particular challenge, the rise of totalitarian Soviet communism.
You know, I think abortion is a really good example of this.
And so Mark Milley, the former chief of staff for the armed forces under Donald Trump, he claims that Donald Trump embodies fascism. It just shows that Mark Milley either doesn't know what fascism is or he's not optimizing for truth.
An external event turned their base out. And I think Trump is a great base motivator. But I don't think that seeing Kamala answer hard questions is in fact something, first of all, because like how many people who are not already ready to pull themselves by their tongue over a flaming lake that is then surrounded by a high wall of broken glass to vote for Kamala Harris, how many of those people are ever going to see more than a clip or two from this interview? And they're not necessarily, I mean, this is the tragedy of social media for campaigns, right? They're not necessarily going to see the clip you want. Right, you know, like 10 years ago, you could count on that. Like the networks were pretty much going to run stuff that made a Democrat look pretty good, and that's not true anymore. And so I think if that was the strategy, it is a bad strategy. I am really not sure why she did that interview.
All right, so let's stick with you, Megan, on the substance.
Okay.
It was an aggressive interview.
Yeah.
You can still count on the networks choosing those clips that will show the Democrat to the advantage and Trump to a disadvantage. It's just that so many people now get their news and information from other sources than networks.
How did she do?
My overall impression watching this was, first of all, that Kamala Harris, for the first time, found out what it's like to be a conservative being interviewed by the mainstream media, and she did not like it. And her supporters did not like it. They did not think that was fair. They did not think that this is like good, hard-hitting journalism. They thought that was an ambush. And the second thing is that I don't think she handled it particularly well. I actually think that in the beginning she did. When I was watching her in like the first few minutes, I was like, yeah, Bret Baier's going too hard and she is.
Yeah, I don't think Bret Baier did a good job, right? This kind of gotcha journalism sounds good to your base.
Well, it was must-see TV last night. Bret Baier pressed Vice President Kamala Harris on everything from the border to the economy to Joe's mental fitness during her first formal sit-down interview with Fox News as vice president.
And with less than 3 weeks to the election day, the Democratic nominee trying to make the case that she offers a new way forward.
Okay, let's show the actual interview.
Vice President, thank you for the time.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, Brett.
You know, voters tell pollsters all over the country and here in Pennsylvania that immigration is one of the key issues that they're looking at this election, and specifically the influx of illegal immigrants from more than 150 countries. How many illegal immigrants would you estimate your administration has released into the country over the last 3.5 years?
All right, so that's a very challenging and perhaps deceptive question, and it's not necessarily cogent to expect that the vice president would be able to give you a number. I think you could have asked less of a gotcha question. There's a downside to asking gotcha questions, and there's a downside to beginning an interview with a gotcha question in that you just put the subject much more on guard and you limit what they're going to tell you.
Well, I'm glad you raised the issue of immigration because I agree with you. It is a topic of.
So she was drilled to not answer the questions as asked, but to pivot to her talking points.
Discussion that people want to rightly have, and you know what I'm going to talk about.
Yeah, but
right
do you
now,
just a number? Do you think it's 1 million, 3 million?
Brett, let's just get to the point. Okay, the point is that we have a broken immigration system that needs to be repaired.
So your Homeland Security Secretary said that 85% of apprehensions.
I'm not finished. We have
it's a
an
rough
immigration
estimate of
system
6 million people have been released into the country.
Yeah, this is completely unnecessary for Bret Baier to keep interrupting her when You only allow her a few seconds to start to answer.
Let me just finish. I'll get to the question, I promise you.
I was beginning to answer.
And when you came into office, your administration immediately reversed a number of Trump border policies. Most significantly, the policy that required illegal immigrants.
Right. The longer the question, the worse. Right. This is incredibly awkward and way too long on the part of Brett Baier. He's just making himself and Fox look bad to people who are even-handed on this issue. So overall, people who hate Kamala Harris found lots to hate in this interview, and people who love Kamala Harris found a lot to love. Brett Baier could have done a much better job without interjecting himself and talking so much and interrupting her so often.
To be detained through deportation, either in the U.S. or in Mexico. And you switched that policy. They were released from custody awaiting trial. So instead, included in those were a large number of single men, adult men, who went on to commit heinous crimes. So, looking back, do you regret the decision to terminate Remain in Mexico at the beginning of your administration?
At the beginning of our administration, within practically...
That was not Kamala's call, right? She's vice president. She is an employee. What your boss decides to do is not your responsibility. What Joe Biden decided to do was not Kamala Harris's responsibility. The Republicans want to tie Kamala Harris to the Biden administration and its policies, but she had no independent rule. All she could do is what the president ordered her to do.
Hours of taking the oath, the first bill that we offered Congress before we worked on infrastructure, before the Inflation Reduction Act, before the Chips and Science Act.
I find it unbearable to listen to politicians in general. To the extent that Donald Trump is compelling is because he doesn't sound like a politician. So I'm not particularly interested in Kamala Harris's talking points, but I do find the analysis of these high IQ people on the Dispatch more interesting.
She's holding up. She's doing okay. But I think towards the end, it was bad. And it was bad for a couple of reasons. First of all, Kamala Harris got asked questions she never has to answer because, again, she's not a conservative going on the mainstream media. She is mostly in friendly outlets. So
the news media doesn't do itself any favors when it asks gotcha questions, whether they're coming from the right or the left. When you're injecting your moral judgments into a question, it just shuts down the interview subject and gives you an inferior interview.
She got asked questions that I think a lot of people have been wanting to hear asked for a long time, like, when did you start to know that Joe Biden was having cognitive problems?
The number one question I said when she took over his campaign, and yet she had not been asked. She took over his campaign in mid-July, and she had not been asked that question.
And also clearly had not prepared an answer for that question.
She doesn't listen to this podcast because I've been saying the question for however long that's been, 4 months.
I falsely predicted that this was going to be a problem for her, and it wasn't because all of her interviewers just politely failed to ask the obvious question. And so that was a bad one. Why did you want to provide?
So Kamala Harris has a long history of not being prepared. And this just feeds into that narrative of laziness.
Sex reassignment surgery for illegal immigrants held in federal detention. There were a lot of bad questions there. And she basically
good questions that she didn't want, that were bad
they
for her.
They were bad questions for her. And I think, look, here's the thing. She's in a bad spot. First of all, when everyone had a terminal case of Twitter brain in 2019, she took a lot of really just totally, even if you think they're like philosophically defensible, they are politically indefensible. There is no universe in which the American public wants to talk about why we should be providing, surgeries that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and are not like saving anyone's life in the next 10 minutes for.
So the more secure you are, the easier it should be to say that you were wrong and that you changed your mind on something, such as supporting sex changes for illegal aliens who are in American prisons. That's going to be wildly unpopular. That's the Trump ad that keeps playing again and again and again during football games because it must resonate with middle America.
For illegal immigrants.
For illegal immigrants held in federal detention.
Right. The outstanding characteristic of Kamala Harris, as I mentioned in my Decoding Kamala Harris episode about 2 months ago, is her glaring insecurity. And it just seems to be the one explanatory variable that both has explanatory power and predictive power. Because someone who is this insecure is going to be incredibly brittle and is going to have much more difficulty pivoting and admitting that they'd ever made a mistake.
right? That is just not like a big political winner. She has the problem that her administration is unpopular, and my personal opinion on this is just throw him under the bus. He's already kind of going out there and being difficult. It's not helping you. Just be like, yeah, we made a lot of mistakes, but I'm going to fix them. But also, it was funny. I was actually watching it while chatting with a friend who's an economist and who just started feeding the questions into ChatGPT.
Oh my.
And ChatGPT was doing way better than Kamala Harris. It was coming up with like deflecting positive answers that like changed the subject, but didn't just come off as like, I am extremely angry that you have dared to ask me a hard question. And so I don't think it went great, which I think feeds back into my question of why did you do this? Why did you do this and then not prepare for the questions that were likely to be asked? Like, did no one on the media team see this coming?
Oh,
Why did they just...
Can I
think the
hijack
answer
on
to
this
that-
a
Yeah.
second? Sarah, I'll ask you the question. Like, I'm less harsh on the interview than Megan is. I think it's kind of an ink block test. But I think under conventional, normal rules of politics, it was she did badly. I just don't think it did badly in the way that reflected on Twitter. But that said...
Oh, I don't think it was a disaster. I just think it like...
Mickey Kaus has some sharp observations about Kamala Harris. She says the Fox interview made me change my view of Kamala's affect, meaning her emotional tone. It's the tone of most Los Angeles donors, most often women, who speak up at fundraisers and insist on holding the floor, even though they have very little interesting to say. Nobody dares to tell them to wrap it up.
Didn't help her.
Wasn't great. Well, we don't know who she's trying to help herself with, so that's my point. Is like, I don't. But Sarah, the question I have is, I put it to you. She's now been asked in 3 prominent places, including last night, what are her differences with Joe Biden? Last night, so far she's given 2 Fs, and last night, I don't know, grade of anywhere from a D to C- answer. What is your theory about why she can't? Because I could come up with an answer that wouldn't be too insulting to Joe Biden, but would still signal real breaks. Why can't she do it? Why won't she do it? It's not like David Plouffe couldn't do it in a heartbeat if you asked him to. I mean, he'd be even better than ChatGPT. So, like, why?
And we should just say for listeners what she actually said this time. It was, she's a new generation of leadership. She had different life experiences than Joe Biden, and that she hadn't spent her whole career in Washington, D.C. And her first 2 answers were, there are no differences.
All right, a winning formula for this type of situation and most type of situations is to be humble, right? To admit when you're wrong, to recognize your strong points and your weak points, and to be confident. Be confident in your abilities to the extent that you have abilities and strengths, and that you have the ability, even with all your weaknesses, to find a way through in life. And Kamala just stands out for her inability to be appropriately humble and her inability to show confidence because of that crippling level of insecurity that just seems to make everything that she says and does seem fake. Did you notice Lizzo at the Kamala Harris rally in Detroit? She says if Kamala wins, right, all of America is going to be like Detroit. How would you like for more and more of America to be like Detroit? On what basis do you think that's a winning message? Steve Saylor says Kamala Harris is a pretty basic girl. The single most meaningful thing to her in her life has been her old sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha, which is composed of very light-skinned black women. It basically operates on a brown paper bag test. If you're any darker than a brown paper bag, you don't get into the sorority. And she just happens to wind up as the Democratic nominee because Democrats would never have chosen her in an open primary. So she lucked into this position that she's in, that she's so dramatically ill-suited for. And at a rally over the weekend, Kamala mocked those who were calling out that Jesus Christ is king, and she agreed with protesters who were accusing Israel of genocide. And I absolutely understand why some people would accuse Israel of genocide. It doesn't strike me as accurate, but the term genocide has become so incredibly flexible that, yeah, there are certainly definitions of genocide that would fit Israel's hard-hitting operation in Gaza. So a majority of women 18 to 29 have tattoos. That fits my life experience. So why on earth would most young American women do something so incredibly self-destructive? Steve Saylor offers a guess. What women would really like is a wedding ring, but a tattoo now represents the female urge toward long-term commitment. So remember the whistleblower, the one, if we said his name, social media would delete your post or your video? Well, Eric, the CIA guy who gave Democrats a premise for the first Trump impeachment, the one that even Liz Cheney voted against, and the Democrats insisted he remain anonymous. Now, with this election near, he talks to the Washington Post, gives his story, still very much wants to remain anonymous. And the Washington Post grants him anonymity. Why? Why does he deserve anonymity? Why should he get off with all the glory and the benefits of triggering a Trump impeachment, but not having to pay the price? People want the glory that comes with doing something brave and disruptive, but often they are unwilling to pay the price. Robin Hanson says, I just attended a wedding that was full of intellectuals, and most of the intellectuals used language that was consistently vague, flowery, and inspirational, quite different from the precise language among law and intellectual specialists. Young progressives are much less tolerant of different views than older progressive or other young people. They're also very engaged. So across the generations, liberals are far more likely than moderates or conservatives to say they'd end a friendship or relationship with a family member over politics. This is why we're likely to have a dramatic mental health crisis in this country if Donald Trump wins. Compared to other generations, Gen Z and millennial liberals were more likely to say they'd sever ties with family or friends. Moderates were the group least likely to say they'd sever a friendship or a familiar tie over politics. So barely 2 weeks after Donald Trump took office, the CIA analyst, who was the whistleblower, touched off Trump's impeachment, was overheard in the White House discussing with another staffer, right, how to remove the newly elected president from office. And he desperately wants to remain anonymous.
2 weeks after President Trump took office, I can't say his name, the CIA analyst, whose name was recently linked in a tweet by the president and mentioned by lawmakers as the anonymous whistleblower who touched off Trump's impeachment, now this is the first impeachment, was overheard in the White House discussing with another staffer how to remove the newly elected president from office, according to former colleagues.
For the place.
Absolutely. They're going to come for you.
Do you really think so, David?
Yeah, I do. I mean, look, I'm definitely...
So why is Elon Musk so all in for Donald Trump? Because he sees dramatic downsides for his businesses if the Democrats occupy the presidency.
Not at the top of the list. Elon's at the top of the list, right?
Yeah,
so
he's
he has no choice but to go all in. They're already doing lawfare against him.
It's ridiculous.
But I think the point is just that if they're not defeated, they're going to keep doing it because there's no downside for it.
I will comment on the California Coastal Commission ruling that was based on Elon's political tweets, which is why they stopped additional launches out of Vandenberg.
What?
First of all, how the California Coastal Commission has authority over Vandenberg and the operations, it just seems to me like there's something wrong. But as of now, they have the ability to block launches out of Vandenberg, which they did. And in their decision, they said it was because of Elon's political tweets.
I think it would be helpful to clarify for the record what the Commission's power is here today in the form of a federal consistency determination.
The Commission doesn't have unilateral authority to just deny this and stop it from happening.
But to bring in his political tweets to make a decision about the progress of SpaceX and allow public space to be used to further that cause and further that activity seems to me abhorrent, and it's ridiculous. And it's exactly what's wrong with the bureaucratic morass that a lot of these institutions have grown into.
She said the quiet part out loud. Yeah. So in a way, she does a favor, which is she acknowledged that all of this lawfare against SpaceX and Elon is political. She basically pleaded guilty to it. Look, she's proud of it because she doesn't think there's anything wrong with it. She thinks this is her job, is as a bureaucrat, she's supposed to punish people who tweet things that you're not supposed to say. That basically is what it comes down to. And I mean, this is the truth about lawfare. They're using the agencies of the federal government to exact reprisals against their political opponents. And if there's not a punishment for that, it's going to keep going.
Right. So often the thing that people accuse you of doing, the thing that they're very conscious that they are doing. So Democrats are often exercising levers of power in the judicial system and in the bureaucracy to punish their enemies. And they are afraid that Donald Trump and the Republicans will engage in the same sort of thing that they have been doing. Now, remember when Elon Musk was thinking of taking over Twitter and Richard Spencer said, number one, Elon Musk is a con man. He hasn't accomplished anything of value. And on what basis did Richard Spencer say this? He watched some YouTube videos. Right? That was the basis of his epistemics. How did he know what he thought he knew? On the basis of a few YouTube videos. He also predicted that Elon Musk taking over Twitter wouldn't make any difference. Well, Elon Musk taking over Twitter has made a dramatic difference. It's made a dramatic difference on the platform, and it's made a dramatic difference outside the platform. If Elon Musk hadn't taken over Twitter, I don't think he would be all in supporting Donald Trump. All right, so we have a message conveyed from the U.S. to Tehran through Iraqi mediators after the death of Sinwar that focuses on the need for calm to avoid the deterioration situation in the Middle East. They don't want war. The elimination of Sinwar has changed the rules of the game. It seems that Washington decided to be patient in any direct discussion with Tehran, wait for the Israeli response. It's worried that the Israeli response may cross red lines that will lead to more tensions in the region. It seems to me that almost all the advice that the Biden administration has given to Israel has turned out to be wrong. Nobody keeps the peace quite like the UN peacekeepers. The Chinese contingent in the UNIFIL peacekeeping force in Lebanon watches as Hezbollah launches rockets into Israel right under its nose. So if the IDF responds and hits these rocket launches, the UN would condemn it for endangering these UN peacekeeping troops that aren't keeping any peace and that Israel wants removed. So we had a major leak of intelligence about the forthcoming Israeli raid on Iran. And we have a long history in both the Biden and Obama administrations of leaks of Israeli plans to attack Iran. Right. So American pro-Iranian forces are leaking intelligence about what Israel might do to Iran. Right, this is what Mike Duran says. None of us find Kamala Harris sincere. We all perceive that she delivers talking points that fail to convince anyone. I see a more general disconnect between the Democrats and independent voters. I suspect we'll conclude after this election that Democrats are badly served by their ideological control of the media and commanding the heights of the culture, thanks to the rise of social media, such as the increased freedom we have on X under Elon Musk. Progressives have imposed an ideological orthodoxy on the cultural institutions of our country. As a result of this imposed orthodoxy, our establishment culture is devoid of real debate, its talking points all the way down from news to sitcoms to Hollywood movies. I haven't had a friendly political discussion with someone who disagrees with me since 2016. Democrats don't understand that media and institutional conformity will not deliver the hearts and minds of the voters. You have to talk to real people, learn where they are coming from. Kamala Harris is an apparatchik of the progressive machine. The Economist has headline here, The Envy of the World, America's Economy, a special report. Here's one this way. The U.S. economy is the envy of the world, the rule of law, large domestic market, stable currency, the most developed financial markets. And for people who think it's a horrible thing to lend money at interest and to have a developed financial system, which countries would you like to live in that don't have those things? There's a strong entrepreneurial culture in America, a stable, though volatile political system. A political system can be both volatile and often vulgar and still stable. There was never a chance that the January 6th rioters, for example, were going to disrupt Joe Biden taking office January 20th. We have abundant natural resources, we have research universities, we have immigration, and we have federalism. The US and Europe operate under a legal regime governing conduct in war, loosely described as international law. It is a relic of the Cold War order. It makes no sense in modern conflict and is unsustainable in a conflict where significant interests are on the line because countries will overwhelmingly side with their interests rather than with anything that interferes with their interests. To some Israelis, the lessons of Sinwar's killing is precisely the importance of resisting American pressure. You Americans are hand-wringing wimps who told us not to go into Rafah, but we did anyway, and we finally killed Sinwar. Get off our backs, and we'll finish the job. So we have many Democratic organs, such as the New Yorker, talking about how Democrats are panicking. What the heck is going on here?
So they're saying, I saw this panic clip this weekend. They're like, we can't depend on Philadelphia anymore. That's a really scary situation, right? They're like, we got to go out into the rural communities and get rural people to vote for Kamala. Yeah, good luck, man. I got all these videos of Amish people with Trump flags on their horse and buggy. I don't think they're going to convince those people to vote for Kamala Harris, but
I have Trump down 20 points in Philadelphia, 19 points. That's probably what I'd expect to see. But Harris is only winning by 5 in the Philly suburbs. Northeast PA is Trump +8. Central PA, Trump. I mean, all the rural, central, and western PA is Trump +4. That's going to include, Pittsburgh and stuff. I mean, all these numbers here make sense to me, and it's a Trump +3. And like the internals, I really want to kind of get at this because we talked a bit about lying. And I think we talked before about how MSNBC viewers exhibited different behaviors and they thought different issues were important, like protecting democracy and abortion. Well, we threw a new question in, which is how likely in the next couple of years America is going to experience another civil war or a revolution. And the number now is 46% of voters in Pennsylvania who think it's at least somewhat likely. That's the highest number I've ever seen. So we've looked at that at a national level. It's been 41% recently in the last couple of years. This is how politically divisive swing states are now. 15% very likely, 31% at least somewhat likely, only 14% say not at all likely. And the real sad one for me is 18 to 29-year-olds who I think are going to turn out big and who I think are going to break more towards Trump than everybody expects. 72% of them, civil war likely in the next few years.
Man, must be some Tim Pool listeners there. Okay, so talking through North Carolina and Georgia. They were hit hard. I think that's a lot of people are scared that those communities get decimated, though nobody shows up to vote because they have no power, like down in Tampa, right? We got no power left. They're saying Thursday we'll have the power back on. Okay, so how are you going to, if my family, my family's not going to go down there, snakes in the yard, like no groceries, gas lines. Is that going to affect the vote? Do you have any concerns about that in swing states like Georgia and North Carolina?
Yeah, that's a tough one because the way pollsters operate, especially North Carolina, is that they're just going to have quotas for different regions in the state, and they're just going to leave the quotas open until the quotas are filled. So you're not necessarily going to get a read on whether people are going to turn out or not because they're affected by the storm.
Right. We have a key member of the Young Turks who says that she has left the Democratic Party after she was molested by a homeless man with an erection in Los Angeles. She says she was shamed by liberals for stating that she feared leaving her house after the incident.
In 2022, it was around March. I was walking my dog. It was not quite dark yet, but the sun was setting. As I'm walking my dog, I see these two guys that were just kind of like moving around weirdly. They seemed kind of manic and their clothes were tattered. So I knew that they were probably homeless. And I also knew that they're probably on something just based on like the twitchy way they were acting. But living in LA, I mean, there's homeless people everywhere, right? So I've never had problems. I didn't think anything of it. But as I was bending down to pick up my dog's mess, one of the guys like grabs me by my hips and he had an erection and just starts like humping me. And I didn't know what to do. Like I was terrified. I didn't have a weapon on me. Yep. Like I had no way of defending myself.
So I think about my physical safety perhaps on average once a month. But from talking to women, they think about the physical safety multiple times a day, right? Life as women experience it is a completely different thing than from what most men experience.
Didn't know how far it was going to go because it's two guys. I'm by myself with my little dog. It was one of the most terrifying things ever because I'm pretty good at defending myself. In that moment, I just knew there was no option.
No way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And luckily, he stopped and they just laughed at me and walked away as they were laughing at me. And so there was the fear and then the humiliation and weirdly shame. Like I felt ashamed.
We decide, all right, how dangerous our country is. We decide how much violent crime. All right, this was violent crime. This was an assault. And we can determine how much of that we put up with by how severely we punish people who do this, right? The average felon who gets convicted, he's committed these violent felonies over 10 times on average before he finally gets convicted for one. We just put these guys away for a long, long time, right? There are going to be fewer of them on the streets, and those who remain are going to feel a stronger risk of conviction and a long prison sentence, and they will be less likely to act out in this vicious way.
For some reason, and it was awful. And it was really taking a toll on my mental health because I have to walk my dog, right? So at least 2 or 3 times a day, I'm going outside kind of scared. And so I opened up about this on the show.
Is she married? Because normally you would hope that your husband would step in to protect you.
Not really thinking much of it. And before I know it, I'm starting to get these messages, and it's like really, really harsh stuff. And it's about how you are painting a picture of the homeless community. You know, how could you be like this? You know, these are your unhoused neighbors and they need help. A few people accused me of being racist when I had never disclosed the race of the individuals who did this to me. And in fact, they were white. And so like when they started accusing me of being racist, I'm like, wait a minute. Why are you assuming that the people who did this?
Of course.
Yeah, like I think you might have a problem here.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that woke me up. That woke me up because I'm like, oh my God.
They eat their.
Okay, let's see what else is in my X bookmarks. This is a quote from the New York Times today. The idea of a movement based on personal choice is deeply troubling to the experts. New York Times quote, the idea of a political movement that rejects expertise and prioritizes personal choice in an epidemic is deeply troubling to public health experts. Well, there are good reasons why they would be troubled by that. So there are going to be public health challenges such as an influenza epidemic where prioritizing personal choice is not going to be the most effective strategy. So there are going to be other health challenges where prioritizing personal choice is the most effective strategy. Right. Representative Matt Gaetz reacts to Joe Biden's revenge arc as he sabotages Kamala Harris's campaign, forcing him out of the nomination.
How are you reading the Biden response to like the Kamala failures? Because he clearly hates her. He hates her. And the press
Tell me about it.
conference.
What do you know? Do you like?
Well, I
do
mean,
you-
I'm
do you
watching
hear
this
anything?
press conference. Joe Biden has not done a single press conference, right? She's getting dogged for
Joe
not.
Biden.
No, it's Joe.
Joe, yeah.
Joe had not done a single press conference from the White House briefing room, okay? Had never gone in there before, his entire presidency. She's getting dogged on the trail for not doing a formal press conference. And so he just rolls in there and does one. It is such an epic troll. It is such a troll. I mean, and then she goes out there with her Mean Girls moment on DeSantis, and then he just happens to, I mean, they've been hiding this guy in the basement.
So I don't think the Biden administration is deliberately trying to undercut Kamala Harris, but Joe Biden is not the sharpest tool in the shed. Never was, and he certainly isn't anymore. So I think it was more of clumsiness on the part of Joe Biden here.
Deeply concerning. That's how U.S. officials are describing the leak of highly classified intelligence documents detailing Israel's preparations for an attack on Iran. Axios was the first to report on that leak, and CNN's Natasha Bertrand is joining us now live. Natasha, with more. Natasha, I know you've been talking to sources as well. What are you learning?
Well, Jessica, we have managed to confirm that these 2 documents that were leaked on Telegram on Friday do appear to be authentic, and they are highly classified documents that suggest that the U.S. has been essentially spying on Israel's plans to retaliate against Iran for that massive missile barrage that Iran inflicted on them on a.
Now, there's nothing weird or inappropriate about the U.S. spying on its allies, including Israel, and to try to have the best intelligence about what Israel's doing. What is disturbing is how often Israel's plans to attack Iran are leaked through the Barack Obama administration, now through the Biden administration.
October 1st. And these documents are marked top secret. They are also they also have markings suggesting that the only entities that should be viewing these documents are the U.S. and some of its closest allies, the Five Eyes Partnership. And so this is obviously very concerning to U.S. officials. And while we are not going to quote from these documents or share them directly, we can outline them broadly. One of them, for example, which is sourced to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, discusses Israel's movement of certain munitions in order to prepare for a possible strike on Iran. Another document, which is sourced to the National Security Agency, discusses the Israeli Air Force's preparations and exercises for a strike, including information about the Israeli Air Force's use of
here's another report.
States they are investigating an unauthorized release of classified documents that assess Israel's plans to attack Iran. That information coming from 3 U.S. officials submitting that to the Associated Press. A 4th U.S. official said the documents appear to be legitimate. The documents are attributed to the U.S. Geospatial Intelligence Agency and National Security Agency, and note that Israel was still moving military assets in place to conduct a military strike in response.
So you often hear from the Biden administration that they are frustrated that Israel isn't telling them about their plans, and they're only finding out after Israel, for example, has planes in the air on their way to go do something. Well, from all these leaks, you can see why Israel would not want to confide in the Biden administration.
Response to Iran's blistering ballistic missile attack back on October 1st. They were shareable within the Five Eyes, which are the U.S., Great Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. Joining us live this morning to first, could you provide some perspective about what we are learning as far as this response of Israel to retaliate on Iran?
So let's put it into context. So we are, and obviously Iran is the head of the Hydra. We are in the midst.
So his voice, he's got Kermit the Frog voice, right? His voice is just stuck at the back of his throat, the bottom of his throat, and it's awful.
Of a waiting period where the Israel is trying to assess what targets are legitimate as far as the retaliation of the last attack that.
Okay, I just can't take listening to this guy much more. Let's return to excellent podcast here from the Dispatch.
Came in where we saw 100.
Here we go.
Nothing comes to mind, which is even worse,
Yeah.
right? Because it's a deer in a headlight answer. So Sarah, why?
So let's start with what she can't do. She can't give specifics. And she can't get anywhere near a specific. Like, not only can she not say, I would not have pulled out of Afghanistan, that specific way. She can't say, we have foreign policy differences, because then you just, okay, what are the foreign policy differences? So you can't even start down any path, because then you have to go all the way down the path. You're basically like, it's the...
And the chat notes that Iran had every right to retaliate against Israel. I don't think rights have much to do with it. I expect every people and every state to fight for their own interests, whether or not this combat is within the acceptable limits of international law.
The scene in Jurassic Park where Jeff Goldblum uses the flares to try to attract the T-Rex, and then the T-Rex comes after him and throws him around. It's not good. So you can't do any of that. So you're gonna have to give sort of these vague answers anyway. So then I would argue that you give the sort of most generic, do no harm answer and just get out of it quickly. I agree with you that I don't think she gave the best version of that when she said none come to mind. I think the reason for that answer is that she wanted to leave herself wiggle room in case that didn't work, right? None come to mind is different than there are none, right? None come to mind allows you to say, oh, I thought about it more and now some come to mind if you need to. So that's why you give that first. Again, I would not have suggested to do that first. Stop leaving yourself outs. I was listening to Leon Neyfak's Bush v. Gore podcast, where you listen to Gore answer questions about Ilian Gonzalez and answer questions about this military base down in Florida. And politicians leaving themselves out and making sure that they don't actually get pinned down wasn't successful 20 years ago. And that was before social media and the sort of crowdsourcing of how bad your answer is stuff. So I don't think she's as bad as Al Gore on that type of stuff. But yeah, I don't think it was good. Megan,
Oh, sorry.
No, go. You go.
I was gonna say, I was watching her do the economy answer, where Brett Baer said, why do people trust Trump more than you on the economy? And like, I am writing an answer in my head that is vague and moves on, which is something like, I think people are still really hurting from the pandemic.
Mhm.
And I think we haven't done as good a job at getting out the message of the good things that are happening in the economy right now. We've got low unemployment. We've got steady growth. And I also don't think that we have communicated.
So the presidency and running for the presidency doesn't usually transform people. Rather, it reveals people. And this is the Kamala Harris that we were familiar with. Highly insecure, very poor at speaking publicly, off the cuff, sounding unprepared, and sounding stilted and stiff. Right? This is who we knew she was.
All of the ways in which we have set the economy up for growth going forward. Here are four. And I am so excited to build on that. And let me tell you why. Like, why doesn't she give what seems like the obvious boilerplate, banal, boring deflection answer that any politician should be able to deliver if you wake them up at 3 a.m. after a legendary bender in Vegas? Why can't she do that?
And
She's
the
not
actual
good.
answer that she gave there was, I think, a perfect distillation of the Republican-Democrat divide right now, which was basically, the experts think that my economic plans are better.
Yes.
Was her response to why Americans don't view her. She's like, well, yeah, but if you actually talk to Goldman Sachs and I think Moody's was who she cited.
Don't forget the 16 Nobel Prize winners.
Yes, correct.
It's like she's running.
All right, so this discussion that we're watching right now is from the Dispatch. It is a bunch of Never Trump Republicans.
She thinks she's running for election in the Harvard faculty lounge, and she's winning that election. But
there's
not many of them.
This gets back to why they seemed unprepared for Brett Baer's questions. And I've said this many, many times before, and this is really pre-2016 or pre-2020 thinking, let's call it, which is Republican comms and campaign operatives always used to speak fluent liberal because they came up through liberal institutions.
Right. So I point out that the Democratic advantage in cultural and political and media institutions is not an irreversible one, because Republicans often win the presidential election, even though most of the elites and most of the institutions are going to be against them. And there are some advantages to not controlling institutions and to having to do battle on the enemy's turf.
And Democratic campaign operatives did not speak fluent conservative. They never experienced.
So most intelligent conservatives that I know can articulate liberal talking points and explain why liberals see the world the way that they do. I rarely notice the same ability with those on the left, particularly with females on the left. I very rarely encountered anyone who's able to articulate a conservative point of view.
Conservatives in their lives or conservative thoughts or arguments, and they certainly weren't watching Fox News.
So most leftists who I know in real life, they explain conservative perspectives on the basis of conservatives are fascist, conservatives are racist, conservatives hate poor people, conservatives are bigots, right? That's the limit of their explanatory power for why conservatives see and experience the world as they do.
And so they were always at a disadvantage, I thought, prepping their principals for any type of conservative conversation because they couldn't murder board it. And so I think a lot of that obviously still shows on the left. I just think it now shows on the right because conservative Republican operatives no longer come up through liberal institutions, or if they do, they intentionally lock themselves in closets and stick their fingers in their ears and go, la, 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 I don't have to listen to you. Megan, I do have one question before I leave.
So on Thursday, we got word that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, had been killed by Israel. Let's get a little bit of perspective on that from Jack Keane.
Well, certainly it's very significant that Sinwar is gone finally. And what we're seeing before our eyes is obviously Prime Minister Netanyahu and the IDF is dismantling the leadership of Hezbollah, obviously the leadership of Hamas as well, and seriously degrading both of those forces. There's likely thousands of fighters still left.
So political scientists will tell you that decapitation strategies don't work, and perhaps that's true. In general, decapitation strategies don't effectively change a war, but sometimes there can be such a drop-off from someone like Yahya Sinwar to the person who takes his place that it will make a significant difference. So sure, maybe in general, decapitation strategies don't work. Also, Orthodox Jews are not on their phones. They're not watching TV during holidays. So Sukkot began Wednesday evening. The news came out Thursday morning that Sinwar was dead. And by late morning, among Orthodox Jews, I know we'd all heard, right, from other people that Sinwar was dead, because some people who attend Orthodox shuls are not 100% observant. And also they have friends and neighbors who may tell them the news, or they may just overhear it as they're walking down the street. So the news gets out.
In Gaza, but not as military organized units capable of still resisting the Israelis in Gaza, for many weeks.
So again, he's got his voice stuck at the back of his throat. That's why it's such a monotone. A good voice coach could help this guy.
Possibly even months to go, but nonetheless, the leadership has been destroyed. Dealing with Hezbollah itself, there's three things happening there. One is to continue the decapitation of leadership. Two, destroy as much of the ballistic missiles, long-range rockets that they can. And three, push away the Hezbollah, who are operating in the south and firing rockets into northern Israel so they can reoccupy. That's the campaign that we see going on right in front of our eyes. I don't think the administration's optimism about a ceasefire is in the offing.
So Jack Keane is a member of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, strongly pro-Israel, strongly pro-U.S. intervention overseas policy to protect democracies. Usually American Jews who are pro-Israel want an interventionist American foreign policy. They're also strongly connected to the government in Israel, and so they often get a lot of inside information.
And the reality is, because the deputy political chief of Hamas, Al-Yahya, has just come out and said he agrees with Sinwar's mandate. The only way we're going to go to a ceasefire is Israel has to withdraw all troops from Gaza and go to a permanent ceasefire. Netanyahu is not going to do that. So it sounds to me that Hamas is in the same place it was prior to Sinwar's death in terms of a ceasefire.
Well, there's a lot of misinformation around this as well. I mean, Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, just said that, Israel killed 42,000 people, but the number really is not clear-cut because it includes Hamas, that number. And we know that Israel has been retaliating for an unprovoked attack on innocent Israelis on that day, October 7th. And ever since that happened, this administration has been calling for a ceasefire. It doesn't look like the Israelis are even sharing information with the U.S. anymore, given the constant chorus of ceasefire, when they're trying to protect themselves.
Yeah, no, Prime Minister Netanyahu hasn't given up on obviously trying to get these hostages out. He's just not going to make a deal that the condition on the ground to do that is a complete withdrawal from Gaza. That would leave thousands.
So I find it fascinating that everyone who's not on the right side of the Israeli political spectrum keeps talking about how the top priority for this war should be the release of Israel's hostages. And there are probably about 50 hostages who are alive. And so are you going to gamble the security of the state of Israel for the sake of 50 hostages? It's just seems obvious to me as a concerned Zionist that your number one priority should be the safety and the security of the United States of Israel, not the safety and security of 50 or 60 individuals. And so it doesn't make sense to me that everyone who's not on the right side of the Israeli political spectrum, and pretty much everyone who speaks on this issue in the mainstream news media, says the top priority for Israel should be the release of its hostages. I would think that the top priority for Israel would be its overall interests, its overall security, its overall standing vis-a-vis its enemies. We got into this situation because Israel under Bibi Netanyahu released way over 1,000 Hamas terrorists to get back one lousy soldier, Gilad Shalit, a lousy soldier, a terrible, terrible deal. I hope Israel never does anything so stupid. Again, incredibly self-destructive. All right, hundreds of Israelis then died in the October 7 attack that was masterminded by Sinwar, who was released as part of the Gilad Shalit deal. It strikes me as just so evidently short-sighted to make the country's number one priority the release of its hostages, just as the United States when Iran took Americans hostage in 1979. It struck me that that should not be the number one priority for the President of the United States. Number one priority should be overall security and thriving of the nation state.
Thousands of fighters still in Gaza, able to grow and re-equip and rearm themselves and conduct another attack. He's not going to go along with a deal like that, and that's really the issue. He certainly wants those hostages out. He's committed to getting them out, but they've got to be on realistic terms, and that's not what we have here. The administration keeps hyping the fact that there's a ceasefire coming and the hostage is going to be released, and this happens every few weeks. We're close to a deal, and none of that has ever really been true, because Sinwar has always held the same position, which is a maximalist position: withdraw from Gaza. That's it. And that's not the case, and those conditions are not realistic for Prime Minister Netanyahu or the Israeli people.
Yeah, General, it's great to get your insights as always. We so appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, great
General
talking,
Jack
Maria.
Keane, and to you, General Jack Keane. There we.
Okay, I want to get back to interesting discussion on the Dispatch. So this is a channel and a news media operation, the Dispatch, which is consistently anti-Trump, but you learn just as much from people who are anti-Trump. You're just as likely to get valuable perspectives as those who perhaps share your pro-Trump bias, just as we often learn at least as much from our enemies and our critics as we do from our strongest supporters.
Though, which is, can you put on your lady pundit hat for a second? As a woman watching the interview between Harris and Bear, I felt like Bear interrupted Harris a lot more than he did when he was interviewing Donald Trump. He
did. He conducted the interview with Harris in a much more hostile and gotcha manner than he did with Donald Trump. And I have no problem with treating men and women differently, just as I have no problem treating adults and children differently, treating aristocrats and plebs differently. So I'm not an egalitarian. So therefore, I'm fine with what are often called double standards. So I don't think Bret Baier conducted a good interview.
A lot more deferential interviewing Trump and respectful interviewing Trump. He seemed to personally respect Trump in just the way he phrased things. And I think part of it, like, it did come off a little gendery to me.
I am going to disagree on that.
Yeah,
because
good.
I think if you watch a mainstream media interview of Trump and you compare it to the tongue bath that Harris is going to get, right? That's just the reality of partisan media these days, which is
partisan, not gender.
I think it was partisan. I think it was he was playing to his audience, and had that been Joe Biden, had it been Pete Buttigieg, had it been Josh Shapiro, had it been anyone else sitting in that seat who was running for president of the United States, they would have gotten the same treatment. I do think, though, that it reads differently because it's gender, right? Like, I think there is a fundamental thing where we don't like to see men getting super aggressive on women. That, there are real gender disadvantages of running for office and doing many things, because if you are aggressive, you are perceived differently from a man, and it's a really hard tightrope to walk often. But I think that there are also advantages, and one of them is that if your male interviewer starts getting super aggressive, people just get a little like, what? Why are you just attacking that woman? And so I think, and that is, I guess, the argument for it, right? You do Bret Baier rather than Harris Falk.
Right, the average man is stronger than 99.9% of women. Right, there are significant biological differences between men and women, and men are just far more aggressive. They're far higher levels of testosterone. They're far more likely to commit murder. Women have more focus on picking up and abiding by social cues and social norms. Men and women have different strengths and weaknesses. Completely makes sense to me that the wise person speaks to a woman differently than he speaks to a man. The wise person treats a woman differently than he treats a man.
Or someone else, you do you ask for a male interviewer so that the clips will play and you can enrage your audience. And I think the problem with that, though, is that she didn't generate any good moments of handling that well. And that's what you need for a clip to go viral, is where you are like actually saying something that your audience is going to want to hear.
What about her moment when Bear's asking her about?
So it's interesting that Maria Bartiromo, who did all sorts of horrendous things promoting Donald Trump's lies regarding the 2020 election and hosting just complete nutcases, making bogus points on behalf of Donald Trump's ridiculous fixed election claims. And she still has a job at Fox, while Tucker Carlson, who generally mocked the Trump claims about a fixed election. He was the one who was let go. And Maria Bartiromo, she, more than anyone at Fox, played a big role in Fox having to pay out $700 million for their false claims about Dominion and the 2020 election. And she still has a job.
About Trump's comments on the enemies within. And she says, that is not the clip. You're playing only the part of the clip where he's getting to respond to the outrageous thing he said. You didn't play the clip where he actually said the outrageous thing. And Brett kind of like flim-flams around, and then she's like, nope, you didn't play it.
I think
thought
that's
that was pretty
too. It's not that it's not good. It's way too inside baseball, right? I mean, and look, this is my theory of politics, which is anything where you are trying to get a movable voter at this point in the election, which is someone who's not paying a ton of attention to politics, right? The minute it's like Democrats just love process stuff, and I actually think this is why.
Yeah, so I see facts on the ground. A significant difference between Republicans and Democrats is that Democrats are much more process-oriented. People in the center-left and those among the elites and those who dominate our institutions are much more process-oriented. And it strikes me that traditionalists and conservatives are a little more ends-oriented. And sometimes the ends do have more importance than the means, right? Sometimes it is worth doing dastardly means to achieve significant ends. And then sometimes the means are more important than the ends. It's not as though inevitably one outweighs the other. But by presenting this perspective, I show that I am not a liberal. So from a realist perspective, I would expect the primary goal for most individuals is to survive, that the primary purpose for most nation states is to survive. And this is very much an ends-oriented rather than a process-oriented goal. From the perspective of traditional Jewish law, a Jew may violate any Jewish law but 3 to survive, right? He may not commit certain forms of sexual immorality to survive, and he may not worship idols publicly, and he may not publicly deny God's existence. Other than that, he can pretty much break any Jewish law if necessary to survive. He can't commit murder to survive. So it strikes me that the more nationalist you are, the more tribalist you are, the stronger your in-group identity, the more ends-oriented you will be, right? And the more liberal you are, and the more liberal your country, the more diverse your country, the more process-oriented it will be. So in Judaism, there is a dispute about the possible existence of an extra halakhic, above Jewish law morality, right? Is there a plane of morality above Jewish law, or is right and wrong simply determined by what the halakha, what the law says? And I think often there is a left-right difference with regard to means and ends, or this might be more of a mainstream versus extremist difference, where people in the mainstream are much more likely to be process-oriented, and the more extreme you are, the more likely you are to be ends-oriented. Think about the left-wing chant, no justice, no peace, right? That's not process-oriented, it is ends-oriented. Unless you give us the ends that we want, we will not allow you peace. So Black Lives Matter, Antifa, Oath Keepers, and the Proud Boys, they don't seem terribly hamstrung by concerns about process. So liberalism seems to put process as the highest value. So, for example, the 2020 election was valid from a liberal perspective because it followed legal processes, and all challenges were rejected by the system, the courts. On the other hand, conservatives see a corrupt process to change voting laws by fiat. And you had people such as Mark Zuckerberg lavishly funding attempts to make voting particularly easier for largely Democratic voters, and that these voting laws were much more effectively carried out by Democrats than Republicans for the COVID 2020 election. Liberals control virtually every major institution in this country, with the partial exception of the military and the business. And almost all of these changes to our voting laws for the 2020 election were not voted on by legislatures. So there's certainly a procedural liberalism. And when the left has controlled the courts, they have gloried in the ability of courts to strike down legislation and directives coming from either the legislative or the executive branch. So they're ends-oriented and rules-oriented regime. You've got procedural versus substantive justice. So substantive justice is a cause more associated with socialism, and procedural justice is much more embraced by liberalism. So those who venerate the Constitution and see themselves as abiding by a constitutional point of view are going to be much more rules-based, means-based, and against the idea of a common good, which is often used to attack the process and constitutionalism. So German basic law is much more collectivist than American law. It assigns a legal status to political parties to participate in the formation of the will of the people, right? So that's much more substantive than procedural. Common good thinking is often a Catholic thing, such as Adrian Vermeule is very hot for acting in the common good rather than just following the process. So populism doesn't strike me as terribly process-oriented. Now, in some forms of populism, right, it was process-oriented and constitutionalist. But there were differences between, say, the Southern populists who were constitutionalists and the Northern populists who were much less so. So the Schmittians in the US, particularly at Harvard, ridiculed the naive faith in the Constitution in favor of much more discretionary power by those who could seize it. So Trumpism doesn't strike me as particularly process-focused. Michael Anton doesn't strike me as process-focused. The more individualist the society, the more process-oriented it must be. The more fractured the society, the more process-focused it must be to function. Normally, the argument that the system is corrupt in America has come from the left. And so if you believe that our system is corrupt, then you have to aim for higher changes than just process. Now, it seems in contemporary political discourse, the argument that the system is corrupt, it seems to come primarily from the populists and the right. So the more strongly you believe and argue that there's something rotten in the system, the less likely you are to place process as the highest good. From a liberal perspective, what is the primary purpose of the United States? To decrease oppression and ignorance, to allow for ever more human flourishing by following the process established by our leading institutions, the courts, the professions, bureaucracy, education, and the media. So does the United States have a greater purpose than just following process? Think about that.
I am voting on didn't steal the election, right? Didn't try to steal the election, I should say. But just seems empirically obvious to me that most people are not going to dive into the deep weeds of your statistical arguments about why there weren't vote anomalies or any of the rest of it. Once you're making a process argument, you're losing. And I think this is similar. Once you are like trying to adjudicate between different clips of Trump talking about this, like you've already gone one level beyond anything that is going to help you on social media. It's too complicated.
So Declan, want to broaden this out here. There has been a palpable vibe shift in the pundit world. And it goes something like this. Harris takes over the nomination from Biden, and OMG, Harris, her approval ratings shoot up, the poll numbers shift. This looks really good for Harris. This is Harris's to lose now. Let's see if she can hold on to it. I mean, it's a tight race, obviously, yada, yada. Oh, she's losing some altitude. She's losing some altitude. Trump keeps holding on, but he's got a 47% ceiling. Oh, maybe his ceiling isn't exactly 47%. And then in the last week, pretty abruptly, it's this race is over. Trump has won. The real question is whether it's an electoral college landslide, i.e. he wins Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and maybe even Wisconsin, maybe closely in all of those, but he wins all of them. Or he just wins Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, and he just wins. What's with the vibe shift among the reporting class? Is it actually based on something real, or is it groupthink? Explain, everyone, Declan.
Well, it's a reaction to private polling on both the part of Republican and Democrat elites. So private polling tends to be much more comprehensive than public polling. A lot more money is poured into private polls so that you can be more effective in operating your campaign. And generally speaking, the private polls show Trump in a more favorable position in the 7 battleground states by between 1 to 3 percentage points. And if you follow Mark Halperin's shows, right, you learned this about 5 weeks ago, that on both sides of the political spectrum, it appeared that Donald Trump was in a very strong position to win based on private polling. A few more thoughts on process versus ends. So does America, for example, have a greater purpose than just following the Constitution and just following the process? And I think it does. The preamble to the United States Constitution states, "We, the people, to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain, establish this Constitution." So the purpose of the Constitution is to create a more effective, a more just, a more defensible republic for our own welfare and the welfare of our children. So following legal processes will be the most effective way to provide for the common defense and to promote the general welfare in general. But there will be exceptional times where the Constitution is going to be placed in a limited state, because there will always be emergencies that come along that the ordinary rules do not properly provide for. And so all sorts of ordinary rules will have to be suspended so that the state can respond to an emergency. And this is true for all functioning democracies, that when a real emergency comes up, or the prospects of an emergency, you have all sorts of rights that were heretofore taken for granted are suspended so that you can meet this state of emergency. And I think that conservatives and radicals of all types are much more at ease with this need for states of emergency, states of exception. So conservatives understand that the purpose of the United States and the Constitution is to provide for ourselves and for our posterity, for our children. So for conservatives, America is not primarily an idea. It's not primarily an experiment. It is a judicious way of protecting ourselves and our children from a dangerous world, and our safety is more important than always following procedures. And so the U.S. Constitution, from a conservative and from a nationalist and from a radical perspective, is not a death warrant. So I love my family, I love my friends, I love my community, and there are sometimes things that are more important to me than simply following the process. And the enemy is he who threatens the lives of people I love. Right? Conservatives often claim cultural oppression, Ronnie Goldman notes. All right? They have a powerful sense there's something unnatural and inauthentic about liberalism. So today's culture wars are a recapitulation of the struggles by which the modern first emerged out of the pre-modern. It is a clash between elites trying to inculcate the disciplines and repressions of the modern identity and the great unwashed masses trying to resist this wiping out of their traditional, often disordered folkways, a role now filled by quote-unquote traditional American values. So conservatives will feel oppressed, culturally oppressed by power-hungry, control-obsessed liberals. People on the left will see this as just right-wing rhetoric, because the traditionalists, the people, have not fully internalized the modern ideal of the enlightened self. Conservatives are much more viscerally attuned to the cultural contingency, and they are more averse to the particular forms of the disciplined, disengaged agency into which liberals are more successfully socialized. So contemporary liberalism represents the apex of the disciplinary impulses that spawned modernity. The idea that disembodied brains and use of reason can decide right and wrong, meaning and purpose, and rationally and effectively decide a path forward.
Sure.
And one manifestation of this liberal belief in reason is the way that the Joe Biden administration is constantly trying to micromanage Israel's wars and Ukraine's wars. I don't think a Trump administration would nearly as much try to micromanage the military strategies of its allies. Right? This seems to be much more a manifestation of the liberal belief in reason rather than a traditional perspective that recognizes that wars tend to spiral out of control and that we are usually driven by forces much more powerful than reason. We primarily use our reason to justify the things that our body and our socialization already wants to do.
We have the attention span of like a little kitten, and telling the same story for more than a week at a time gets boring. And I think particularly if the same story it's a coin flip and either person can win, and we are no more able to predict it than you are, our listeners.
Right. News business is a business, and it has its biases, but it has to continually provide new perspectives. and it's going to be constantly on the hunt for something new and exciting, so that it can sell ads and sell subscriptions.
Listener and viewer, the past two election cycles, 80,000 votes in 2016 and 180,000 votes in 3 states in 2020. There's no real world in which anything that we're doing now is, and please don't turn off the podcast. This is valuable use of your time, and continue to support your local news outlets. But we're kind of in the dead zone at this point, where the fundamentals have happened, barring some sort of real dramatic October surprise, which again could very well happen. We are 19 days away out at this point. That it is kind of just a, what are the people who are not paying attention to any of this stuff going to decide to do? And it's, I did think that because Harris, we only had this 90-day campaign, that it could be some sort of, all right, we can sustain, one narrative for 90 days. But I think people kind of got bored of that thing, and we're just going to kind of, this will flip 3 or 4 more times before November, and we could ask the same question next week. But Sarah, I did have one question for you. I think it was either July or early August, we were talking, and you said something along the lines of, if I were the Harris campaign, I would try to make it to November without doing a single interview and see how long you can make it. Do you still think that would have been the best approach, or what kind of shifted their calculus? They did make it about 4 weeks from that point.
Yeah, I think they did the worst of all possibilities. If you're going to cave, it was better to cave earlier. The last thing you want to do is have your candidate out for the first time, giving hard interviews right when people are voting. You want to do that where the gaffes don't matter. You still have lots of time left. It's what primaries are really all about in some sense. So either you got to stick with the strategy come what may, or you got to decide ahead of time, you know what, we could try the strategy, but chances are we're going to cave. I think that a few things happen here. One, I'm sure that they did say, if we do this strategy, we have to stick with it. And then someone said, okay, but we can't cave. The problem, I think, is you have a new staff with a new principal. So yeah, she had some people who'd been with her, but not really, and not in these circumstances. And so, generally, whether your candidate's someone who's going to revisit decisions or not. And maybe in this case, they didn't really have that type of deep knowledge of their candidate because they hadn't gone through a primary with her. 2, when you're down, all of the options look better than status quo. And so if that vibe shift that we're talking about, they sense too, and I will tell you, I think some of the vibe shift came because folks are reading into what the Harris campaign was doing. And I remember the Friday before Election Day in 2016, Hillary Clinton went to Michigan. And I said, Rutrow, the most valuable thing you have in the last, maybe the whole time you're in a campaign, but certainly in the last few weeks of a campaign is your candidate's time. You're not trying to raise money anymore. It's just their time at that point. And so if you're taking your candidate's time to go to a state that we all think is a deadlock for that candidate, it means internally they have such bad polling. Not only did I say it probably doesn't even show that she's up by 1 or 2 points, it might show that she's down. And that because if we're up by 1 or 2 points, you'd be like, well, that's just sort of a weird poll. But if you're consistently showing that it's tied or she's down, you're going to send her to Michigan. So similarly, at the point that you see them changing strategies, doing this media blitz, going to states like Michigan, and there's a chance that you just read a lot into that, which is they think they're losing this race if it were held today. And let's just say Michigan this time looks a lot like 2016. If you assume that these states kind of rise and fall together and that Pennsylvania is the middle one, so it's like a tug of war game, and whoever gets Pennsylvania across their side wins, but all these other states are stacked up behind Pennsylvania on either side. So if she's fighting over Michigan, Pennsylvania's already gone by that, tug of war metaphor. And same, by the way, with Trump and a state like, North Carolina, let's say, or probably even Georgia. He's going to win those states before he wins a state like Pennsylvania. But when the Harris campaign made such, I think, an abrupt strategic change, everyone was like, ruh-roh, she's losing.
Boy, it's really a pity.
So I recognize that in all likelihood, whether Kamala Harris or Donald Trump is president of the United States, it's not going to make much of a difference to most people most of the time. I recognize that whatever happens in the Ukraine war is not going to affect the well-being of Americans. And I recognize that the death of Yahya Sinwar and what happens between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah and even Iran is not going to affect the lives of ordinary Americans. I'm particularly invested in what happens in Israel because I'm a convert to Orthodox Judaism and a Zionist. So the death of Sinwar meant a great deal to me. but it's not going to make any difference to the lives of ordinary Americans, to the best of my knowledge.
Pity that Pennsylvania doesn't have a popular Democratic governor who could have been chosen as his VP.
Perhaps Kamala Harris does much better in receiving a hostile interview where she is able to summon some energy and enthusiasm that she couldn't otherwise gather.
Momentum, positive momentum, right? It was like another poll comes out and she's 0.5 ahead where she was in the last one. And people could overread that in thinking that it was more momentum than it really was, but at least it wasn't momentum in the other direction. And then all of a sudden it looked in the polls like she was stalling. And this coincided with a change, and who knows what they're leaking, what people are hearing behind the scenes about her polling, but it coincided with a change in her media strategy. And people are like, holy crap, if we're seeing this stalling in the public polls, imagine what they're seeing in their own polls. That's why she's doing this media strategy. And then they invested more importance in the media strategy than it should have had, because their media strategy from the beginning and Sarah, you made this point before, it's like if you do 100 interviews, one bad interview just gets averaged out into the interview average. If you wait until 19 days, 20 days to go before the election to give your first hostile interview, I mean, people cover it and pay attention to it. I did post-interview analysis on CNN last night in prime time and again this morning.
Thanks
because
very much.
CNN is covering this interview like it was essentially a mini debate. And that is not a sign that the strategy has worked. But I do think, I appreciate that I'm more of a feminist ally of Kamala Harris than Megan here is, but
self-hating. Always have that.
I do think that it's those right brain libertarian feminists. They're just they're so sui generis. But no, I think one of the things that interview proved was that she's actually better. That aggressive interviews are better for her than softball interviews. Her worst statements are when the interviewer is trying to help, which in turn it amplifies another headwind for her, which is the idea that the establishment is just trying to anoint her and sneak her into the office. And then they see that, she gets these incredibly softball interviews from people and then she gets bad answers. And if she had done more hostile interviews earlier, she'd be better practiced at it. But also she's actually better when she's angry. When you get the angry chick prosecutor out of her, that's more compelling than the, successories poster copywriter.
It's also
Bruce Hoffman is my favorite expert on terrorism. And there are certain cliches that we're told about fighting terrorism that don't always apply. And Israel may be providing examples of exceptions to the normal rules. Here's a discussion with Bruce Hoffman and some other people on the Council on Foreign Relations, an American think tank specializing in U.S. foreign policy.
Military campaign in Gaza. There's a lot of questions about now whether Israel would be seeking a truce with the killing of Sinwar's death, but you say that's not the right question. How does this change Israel's strategy for a complete military victory over Hamas, if that's even
All right, this is Bruce Hoffman who's about to speak.
possible? And what might a post-Hamas Gaza look like? Does Hamas keep fighting under new leadership? Does this prolong the war? Set the scene for us where we're going right now.
Right. Well, there's been a lot of talk about ceasefires or truces, but ceasefires are generally entered into in warfare when there's some sort of a stalemate, and truces are.
So part of the belief in the Enlightenment and part of conventional liberal thinking is that most of our problems can be solved by talking. And diplomacy is obviously a form of talking. And generally speaking, liberals have much more faith in talking and the application of human reason to solve disputes than do non-liberals. So the liberal mainstream elite expert consensus is that Israel should put its primary focus on diplomacy. Israel under Bibi Netanyahu, however, is trying to solve many of the country's problems through changing facts on the ground, which goes against the elite consensus, but might be working.
Rise when both sides are exhausted. I mean, what's clear is that in the past month, the center of gravity in this war has shifted, whether it's decisively or not, but it seems more decisively than ever in Israel's favor. A lot of the arguments that the Biden administration made about fears of expanding the war to southern Gaza, the efforts to blunt an IDF offensive into Rafah, were ignored for the reason that, exactly as you described, Elise, Israel, which I'm not sure was understood in Washington, that Israel was looking for a new status quo, not a return to the status quo ante, that would have given rise to, in the future, the sixth Gaza war. I mean, don't forget, for the past decade and a half, there's been 5 wars fought between Israel and Hamas. So I think in this stage, and judging from what Prime Minister Netanyahu's strategy has been, it's to prevent that sixth war and to change the security dynamic. This is an even-essent opportunity, perhaps, to do so. It is true that leadership decapitation in the past has not been a magic.
Okay, evanescent, meaning fleeting. This is perhaps a rare opportunity for Israel to so significantly change facts on the ground that they are able to provide a higher level of safety and security for the Jewish state that may well last years.
Solution that has ended a terrorist campaign. But let's face it, this is a very different terrorist campaign. It's a counter-terrorist campaign, I should say, sorry. It's one that has accounted tragically for so much civilian death, suffering, deprivation, certainly. But it's
right, unless you're willing to do the hard work, which will entail a significant toll on enemy civilians, you cannot win a war. It was taken for granted throughout history that civilians would pay the price of their state, and that you almost always would have to kill enemy civilians to accomplish your purposes in war. As international humanitarian law and international human rights have achieved more and more importance, there is now greater stress on reducing civilian casualties, even at the cost of achieving the aims of war. That is increasingly the elite consensus. That is not how war has ever been conducted before. It's not a realistic approach to war.
It's also at least halved, if not more than halved, Hamas's fighting capability. The fact that Sinwar was killed above ground and not in the tunnels means that the IDF strategy of at least paring back that huge universe of tunnels has succeeded. By taking out the tunnels, the IDF is also systematically dismantling Hamas's military capabilities to make good on Prime Minister Netanyahu's pledge that Hamas will never be able to stage another October 7th attack. And let's roll this back a year ago when Sinwar, Hania, and others were promising, waves of future Al-Aqsa floods. So for me, it's, does Israel now accept the calls for a ceasefire when it has a very rare opportunity to...
Right. Why would you accept calls for ceasefire if it goes so dramatically against your best interests, right? Israel seems to be doing devastating damage to its enemies, to Iran's proxies, and to reveal the vulnerabilities of the Iranian regime that were not widely seen prior to the last few months. So why would Israel stop now when it seems to be winning?
Defeat Hamas, which is different from destroying it. As a political movement and an ideological movement, will never be completely eliminated, but to defeat it and to ensure that it cannot for the foreseeable future. I mean, everything in the Middle East is evanescent.
And Israel has had its successes precisely because it's gone against the advice of the Biden administration.
So Israel's in the process of pulling off a series of the most remarkable military successes in modern warfare that I can ever remember even reading about. Decapitating and perhaps incapacitating Hezbollah, blowing up the head of Hamas in Iran, killing the architects of the October 7th attacks and their mastermind, Yahya Sinwar, on Thursday. So what makes this success more impressive is that they've done it despite the objections from the West and most of all, Vice President Harris and President Joe Biden. Remember, they warned the IDF, don't you go into Rafah. The VP declared she's studied maps. Sinwar was killed in Rafah.
We have been clear in multiple conversations and in every way that any major military operation in Rafah would be a huge mistake. Let me tell you something. I have studied the maps. There's nowhere for those folks to go. And we're looking at about 1.5 million people in Rafah who are there because they were told to go there, most of them. And so we've been very clear that it would be a mistake to move into Rafah with any type of military operation.
They moved into Rafah because that's where the headquarters of Hamas is and was. Joining us now is the chairman of Urban Warfare Studies at West Point, John Spencer. John, thank goodness that Bibi Netanyahu ignored the advice of this administration, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's where not only this mastermind evil person was hiding, but that's where the hostages were. That's where the tunnels, hundreds of tunnels supporting this death cult to survive in Gaza were found. Absolutely.
Right, so if you have a particular hero system, you're going to find Yahya Sinwar, the embodiment of evil. If you have a different hero system, you will see him as a brave warrior fighting for his people. There are many advantages to regarding Sinwar and your enemies as evil. There are also many advantages to recognize that they are fighting under a different hero system. So in general, I prefer understanding the different hero systems that drive people. But what is superior for an analytical and perhaps academic perspective on what's going on in the world around you is often inferior when you are called upon to take the lead and to take action. So the type of approach that is best for politics is not always the type of approach that is best for academia and vice versa.
Thank goodness Israel took its own security in mind and moved forward with that operation and successfully evacuated 90+% of the civilians out of harm's way.
So that you went to see for yourself how the Israelis were fighting. You wanted to see this urban environment. You said it's the toughest environment you've ever seen, worse than Fallujah, worse than Ramadi, and you were impressed with the efforts they made.
So here is a left-wing philosopher in a new book on German sociologist Max Weber and Wendy Brown, and she makes a profound point here. Just as nothing is more corrosive to serious intellectual work than being governed by a political program, whether that of a state, a corporation, or a revolutionary movement, nothing is more inapt, right, inapplicable to a political campaign than the unending reflexivity, critique, and self-correction required of scholarly inquiry. And Andrew Gelman, statistician at Columbia University, notes this is a great point. I do the unending reflexivity, critique, and self-correction thing, and I don't think I'm good at politics. Right? Politics requires bargaining and secrecy. Most people don't enjoy bargaining and secrecy, but it's the work that you need to do when you engage in politics. So the skills and the attitudes and the hero system that you need to succeed in business is going to be different from the skills and attitude and hero system that you'll need to succeed in academia, which will be different from the skills that you'll need to succeed in politics.
To avoid civilian casualties, although the rest of the world didn't get your memo.
Right. No, I've been on the ground 3 times since October 7th, deep into Gaza, Khan Yunis, central Gaza. No military has faced what the IDF has, especially not us. And even any urban battle in history, never with this level of a suicidal enemy that's trying to get their population killed, who has 400+ miles of tunnels, the concrete, the rubble. No military has faced this. And then also, no military has taken the steps that the IDF have, the measures to prevent civilian harm, constraining themselves, put themselves at risk, do all the notifications, all the evacuations, the daily pauses that the IDF have. I was blown away at what they're able to do under the conditions.
And when you report it, with all your credentials, you get blowback from the New York Times. They want to diminish what you're saying as if you're an Israeli apologist. So now that Sinwar's dead, there's a call for another ceasefire, release of the hostages. What do you call for?
I call for the end of Hamas, to allow Israel to get the job done and remove this cancer, which is the butchers of the Palestinian people. That's what we saw eliminated this week, was the butcher of the Gaza people, because any civilian loss of life that has happened since October 7th is at the hands of Hamas. So I say get your facts straight on what is the realm of possible and let Israel finish the job.
We just we seem to run from victory for maybe a quick political exit. On the other side, taking down Hezbollah, the gold standard of terror networks that have created havoc in the region and even in Africa. We're watching Israel take them apart in real time. How much of that terror?
So I am blinded because so many of my friends are Israeli or come from an Israeli background or just strongly committed Zionists. So I recognize that my social connections and my ties and my ideology blinds me to different points of view. And so it's difficult to step back from my particular hero system and to recognize all the strong arguments that there are to be made for a much more isolationist American foreign policy that steps away from the Middle East, perhaps entirely.
Terror organization is left. And how important was it for them to push back on the Biden administration, who told them not to do it?
Right. So they've been told for over a year just to let the Hezbollah rain rockets down for 80 to 100,000 Israelis to be homeless for over a year. No other nation would be asked to do that. And they have, in just 2 weeks, wiped out the Hezbollah hierarchy, the entire organizational chart. But there's still tens of thousands of fighters where they're not supposed to be, under the United Nations, U.S. taxpayer money going to the United Nations to ensure this force called UNIFIL kept Hezbollah out of the border area, and Israel now has moved forward and discovered bunkers and tunnels that are never supposed to be there. Literally giant bunkers with mopeds, weapons, video cameras, prepared to do another October 7th on northern Israel. But Israel has unprecedented, unparalleled in history, eliminating this terror organization, which is the strongest tentacle of the Iran's proxy force.
I wanted to bring you to the last lap, and that is retribution that's certainly going to be coming to Iran. since 1979, they've been an enemy of ours, killing our people, taking them hostage. There's a window open now with their bodyguards, Hamas and Hezbollah, flat on their back. Should we play a role in taking out their nuclear sites, their oil sites, their military sites?
Well, we sure to hell said we would. We said that there would be severe consequences if Iran attacked again. We said don't do it twice, April and October, and they've launched hundreds of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones at another nation. So we said we would be, so I think we should be. But that's a complex political situation, but deterrence has to be reestablished. People believe that this is escalation for Israel to defend itself against 7 different fronts where it's being attacked. It's not escalation. It's trying to establish peace in the region, and the head of the snake has to be dealt with in a way that they never try to do that again. It has to change their behavior.
And what do we take away from Israel's attack plan, the methods and the execution? What do you take away from it?
I take away that Israel will do what it takes to defend itself, and we should be there with them, like we have been, to ensure that this Islamic regime, who vows to not only destroy Israel, has a clock in its downtown to destroy Israel, but it also wants to destroy the United States, and we should be a part of ensuring that they don't think they can ever do that.
You know what John's referring to?
So, on the other hand, you have this former IDF general who says that Israel's
So we have a
societal
stunning
collapse
potential development out of Israel and Gaza Strip. We can go ahead and put this tear sheet up on the screen from Axios. Israel is apparently investigating the possible death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Sinwar credited, of course, with some of the architecting of October 7th. He has been probably the primary target for assassination by Israel.
Right now, it looks like it was as a result of a drone strike, and it was a drone strike on.
Take the W here.
We
got our man.
There's actually 2 ways that we could go. You know, in some ways, it's not a bad development because Sinwar is one of the. We were reading reporting. He wanted to renew suicide.
So this channel, Breaking Points, tends to be on the Israel skeptical side of things.
Side bombers. He was the guy who, who greenlit and planned a lot of the October 7th attacks. And cynically, you know, there'd been obviously an analysis that maybe Israel had put itself in a position.
And there had been some reporting, I don't know whether it's true or not, but he was thinking again of, hey, we need to, get back into the suicide bombing business. And so if he is now taken out as head of Hamas, who knows who fills that vacuum and what the ideology is, try to keep them from getting arrested. Military police has witness testimonies to the assault. It has not.
So these are Israeli soldiers who fought in Gaza, and there have been allegations of sexual assault against Palestinian prisoners. And then there's also been evidence put out that they were innocent of these charges. So why would you be arresting your soldiers who were fighting and risking their lives to protect Israel in Gaza on rather spurious grounds? And perhaps it comes down to what's more important, the process or the ends. Is the goal of fighting the enemy and keeping Israel safe more important than following the details of international humanitarian law?
Not, though, been investigated on the grounds that the assaulted soldiers are afraid to officially complain, even though in its aftermath, some of the investigators involved stopped fulfilling operational roles and one stopped showing up for reserve duty. So these are also, people who are in the military police, who came to arrest these individuals accused of grave crimes with quite a lot of evidence. And the fellow soldiers take out their weapons, barricade them in rooms, assault them directly. And there's been zero.
So you had many of Israel's elite disrupting Israeli society and not doing their reserve military duty, protesting the Bibi Netanyahu government's plans to change the judicial system. So that type of protest was praised by the news media. However, this type of protest on behalf of Israeli military veterans who are in charge of misbehavior, this type of protest now gets strongly condemned by the mainstream Israeli media.
Investigation into any of this, because effectively, the government, certainly a significant part of Israeli society, supported the side that was like, we think it should be fine for soldiers to rape Palestinians and there should be no consequences.
Oh, yeah.
Just a wild.
But we don't have any definitive evidence that they raped Palestinians. We have some rather thin charges. Let's bring Kip back to the show. Kip, what's going on, man?
Good morning, homeboys and fly girls and b-boys and b-girls and parents and politicians and pimps, prostitutes, pickpockets and punks. I'm just glad to be here with Luke. How you doing, Luke?
Great to hear from you, bro.
I noticed you've been gone for a few days, but you mind filling me in on, what got you feeling so refreshed? What you been doing?
Oh, it's been the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, so that kicked in Wednesday night. So the first 2 days of Sukkot are holy days where you're not doing any live stream or working. You're just spending time with friends in synagogue, and it's these are holy days. These are religious forms of holidays, and then we had the Sabbath. So had 3 days off from live streaming, just spending time with friends and community, and time on my own, just reading whatever I felt like.
Yes, sir. When you say holy, you mean in the sense to separate yourself, not in the sense to make whole, right?
Correct. So separation. So there are things that you don't do as opposed to a normal day. You back off from work, you spend more time with friends and community, you have more time to pray, to study, to just hang out, and you are free from any of the onerous obligations of the weekday.
I remember, is it one of the figures in Judaism that maybe is called Yisrael, that was he who wrestles with God?
Yes. Yes.
Am I making that up? Give me the backstory on that. If you can tell it to a Gentile, give me the backstory.
Yeah, so the Hebrew name for the people Israel is Yisrael, and a primary meaning of that word is he who wrestles with God. So there is a different relationship between Jews and God than what you'd find with Muslims and Christians. So if you went to a bar and bar mitzvah, particularly in a non-Orthodox synagogue, you'd very likely hear the bar or bat mitzvah boy or girl arguing with the particular Torah portion that was their Torah portion for their bar mitzvah. And so Jews in general have felt much more free to argue with God than has been true in the Christian and the Muslim tradition. So it's a different type of relationship than, say, Islam, which means surrender to God, and Christianity, which is about faith in God. And in Judaism, the focus is much more on a struggle with God.
Now, is it fair sometimes to make things make sense to me better? Is it fair for me to swap out the word God with conscience? He who wrestles with? Is it okay to say conscience instead of God, or is there a
I would say,
big?
I would say reality would be a more appropriate term. So often I will swap out the word God and use reality instead. So wrestling with reality, because forget God, forget religion. People are constantly wrestling with reality. I mean, we all often choose delusion over reality. And usually the more deluded you are, the less successful you are in life. Sometimes your delusions serve you, but generally speaking, those people who we see as having an above average level of delusion, it's not normally accompanied by a successful and thriving life. So I would say that the word reality is more apt than the word conscience, because conscience is much more narrow.
But you and I are of the agree. We pretty much agree that unless we're just telling a white lie to, say, a significant other or a rabbi or something like that, you and I say to heck with that. We're going to live and die in the battle in the trench with truth, right? You and I are of the opinion that unless it's going to make or break a relationship, we're going to side somewhere else other than.
Yes.
Okay.
I try to live a life that optimizes for truth. Yes.
Okay. You and I was trying to think in our absence of talking, there's a couple of times that it's opposites, the fact of our opposites. That's one of the reasons I like talking to you, because it's like looking under a rock. Sometimes you and I agree the same on things, which is nice. It's nice to get a validation, but a lot of times it's nicer to get somebody to tell you what's on the other side of that rock, what's on the other side of that discussion. But Alan Watt had something a long time ago called Prickles and Goo. And I guess the guys from maybe South Park had put together a cartoon many years ago called Prickles and Goo. And you should check it out sometimes, because I'm gooey and you're prickly. And basically the end result is they're claiming that the world is gooey prickles and prickly goo. I still say it's gooey, and you'll probably still say it's prickly, but that's what makes our talks interesting, I think, right?
Yeah, people. The most important thing in my understanding here is that people don't just see the world differently or believe different things about the world, but people experience the world differently, and it's from our experience of the world that we have these different perceptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things like with you and me is there's a Wordsworth poem called Expostulation and Reply, and I think it's you and me as well, because you're basically saying, what do you think, you're the only person on earth? Just you got to go to work, you got to do this, and you got to do that. And the other side of the poem is the guy telling him that we can feed our mind in a wise passiveness. And so it's like, there again, it's two sides of the coin. One person's like, you got to be going, moving, not let the moss grow on your backside. The other person's going, no. There's something to gain by that. When those Indians are staring off into the space, they're getting something out of that. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, and two quick thoughts on that. So to be a successful writer, you need to spend a tremendous amount of time in solitude. It's an incredibly lonely profession, and often the more time that you spend in solitude just working on the craft of writing, the better your writing will be. Also, when it comes to the college experience, the more socially successful you are, usually the less scholastically successful you are. So usually those who are the most scholarly successful are getting laid the least. They're the least socially successful. So usually I notice this pattern that lower IQ people seem to get laid much more often, and the most scholarly, serious people tend to have the least successful social lives.
Yeah, because one will give in to their inhibitions and the other one will never come off of it. You know what I mean? Come off it, man. They can't do it. They can't. Right. They're too tied to that thing,
Right. I mean, if you experience the joys of sex and particularly the tantalizing joys of promiscuous sex, it's really hard to settle down to the demands of scholarship when you have those possibilities.
And not only that, you will refine your mousetrap, your mind, your whatever, to optimize for whatever. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so your mind can't be scholarly and remember which were the moves that are successful every Friday and Saturday night and put it down to a percentage and keep optimizing. By the way, that's the same way you think a successful ladies' man is, that's the same way a successful salesman is. They'll sit there and take those defeats and they'll lose sleep over them, and they'll find a way to build that bridge. You know what I mean? Yep. And a lot of things about being a salesman is knowing the difference in a statement, a question, or a little literal objection. And people they can't distinguish between the two, and the salesman will talk himself right out of a sale. I've seen it happen more times than I can count. But one thing about advertising that I was going to tell you is, I never in my whole life really liked beer, but those ads from the 1970s where they would say stuff like, weekends were made for Michelob, or another one might say, tonight, let it be Lowenbrow. Or another one might have a dog, Alex from Stroh's, getting the guy's beer and bringing it to him. Another one, like Miller Lite, had the ones with Bob Uecker, who might be the funniest guy ever in baseball. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yes.
Bob Uecker?
Yep.
Okay. They weren't on the surface, it looks like they're selling beer to grown-ups. But they're trying to sell beer to me. It's just that I didn't turn out to be a beer drinker. But those same, that line of thinking has been in my head for 50 years. I shouldn't know who Alex from Stroh's is. So I don't know. One thing that I think.
Okay, let me jump in here. I got two quick thoughts. Usually the more time you spend at something, the better you're going to be. Also, we tend to spend more time the things that we're good at. So yeah, people who are great in sales, or people who are great in scholarship, or people who are great at pulling in new sex partners, usually spending a lot of time doing so, and it always comes at a cost of other endeavors. So one of the things that I appreciate about the laws of Judaism is that it helps you direct your time. So there are all sorts of times that are set aside to spend with community, and there's time that's set aside to spend in prayer, time to set aside to spend in study, and time set aside that you should be working. And people usually are better off with guidance in these things, like how much time to spend with family, how much time to spend alone, how much time to spend in prayer. Because I know all sorts of people who'd like to spend hours a day in prayer when their obligations should direct them instead to spend more of that time in work. So people need guidance often on how much time to spend alone as opposed to other people, how much time to spend socializing as opposed to praying, meditating, studying, and working. So I appreciate the guidance in Judaism because I often lack common sense. And then, yeah, those were my 2 points. Pass.
Yeah. And you know, prayer and affirmation, I'm not religious, but it works. I mean, it works. It's the same thing as The Secret. It's the same thing as, you know, everybody packages it up and says where your thoughts go, your energy flows or whatever. But that's such a truism. But and a lot of times it's just the religious that take advantage of that. But you've noticed that, right? You've noticed how.
Yeah. So I had a friend, Kevin Blatt, and he would use The Secret to sleep with a lot of porn stars.
Right. One thing I was going to ask you about is how long have we had with Kamala? About 2 months now?
I will check.
As the candidate, as the person we're supposed to be throwing darts at, is it 2 months now?
Biden resigned July 21, so I think it's more like 3 months.
More like 3 months.
Yeah.
And I tell you that seems lately, last several elections, people don't vote for as much as they vote against someone. So have we had, I guess it's been 90 days, I'm wrong. We've had 90 days now with the limelight on her. Have we seen enough to have people seen how corny she is, how phony she is, or is it just me?
It depends on your hero system and your personality. So for people who are on the right, obviously Kamala is a turnoff. And for many people in the center, Kamala is a turnoff. But for people who hate Donald Trump, anyone who's not Donald Trump is good enough to vote for. So I don't think there's a huge groundswell for Kamala, just as there was no groundswell of Biden supporters. But there is a tremendous audience to vote for an alternative to Donald Trump.
You're saying the Hollywood and media propaganda has demonized Trump sufficiently, but nobody has really put their claws into Kamala enough to where she's been demonized sufficiently yet in the mainstream.
No. Forget propaganda. There are good, legitimate reasons why people should be concerned about Donald Trump. He's a deeply flawed candidate, and it has nothing to do with the media and propaganda. There are commonsensical reasons why a person who wishes for the best for the United States would have grave concerns about Donald Trump, and there are good, rational reasons for a disinterested observer to instead prefer Kamala Harris. I don't think it requires propaganda to prefer Kamala Harris to Donald Trump. I don't share that perspective, but I recognize that there are strong arguments against voting for Donald Trump.
Right. The one problem we're fighting is that the people who are in on the grift, the people who are getting the government handouts, or the company they own or work for works exclusively through the government or whatever. And we have all the deadbeats faking disability and all that. I think it's now probably around 60% who are grifting in some way, shape, or form off the government, and only 40% who are trying, that are out there earning the tax money, without any sort of grift. What do you think the number is? If it's not 60, where is the number of people who are grifting in some way off the government versus people who are just given and not taken?
Well, let's take out the value-laden term grift and recognize what percentage of the population is pulling in more in government resources than they're contributing through the tax base. So women overall, for example, take in more government resources than they contribute to the tax base. So probably probably 50 to 60% of the population takes more in government welfare than they contribute to the tax base, and probably 30 to 40% of the population contributes more in taxes than they take out in government welfare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've noticed when I was at the Walmart, I noticed they've got I don't know, it looked like a 25-inch TV, high def, you name it, $83. I mean, and then like if you wanted like a 60-inch one, it was like $238. So I don't know. They'll be giving these things away soon just to get people to keep watching TV, won't they? Because
No.
you would think it's gotta cost something north of $50 just to build that TV, wouldn't you think?
Sure, but the prices do tend to come down over time, and also you can buy more material goods per hour worked in the United States than pretty much any other country of which I'm aware.
Right. One thing I wanted to ask you, or just get your comment on, is the right just strikes me as being the non-artists. Not that I'm an artist, because I'm not, but there should be someone painting pictures or doing some sort of art showing Kamala Harris with like puppeteer strings holding her up and this kind of thing, the way she was like just kind of installed, so to speak, kind of like in a Soviet way. And then like, where's the art for Joe Biden? Where's the Humpty Dumpty comparisons? Is the right just bad at art? What am I missing here?
The best artists are going to be on the left because the type of personality that creates the best art tends to be very high in openness, and being high in the personality trait of openness correlates with being on the left politically, just as being high in the personality trait of conscientiousness correlates with being on the right politically. So you can get a pretty good handle on somebody's politics just by looking at how they keep their room, or looking at what type of art they have on their walls, or the type of poetry that they enjoy. So people on the right, they prefer poems and stories that have a clear and definitive purpose and meaning and ending, while people on the left prefer poetry and stories that's much more open-ended and ambiguous. So there people on the left eat a wider variety of food. People on the right prefer the same tried and true foods that they eat over and over again. So from the way people keep their homes to the type of art that they appreciate to what people eat, the hobbies that they pursue, and how they dress themselves, these all correlate with different types of politics.
Right. You remember there was a hateable lady that did a Peloton ad. Do you think the Peloton ads are think you're gonna be assaulted with Peloton ads this year, or do you think that little craze is over and done with?
I only vaguely paid any attention. I usually tune out when the ads come on, but yeah, I do remember there were a lot of Peloton ads, and I don't think there are nearly as many now.
Right, but Pelotons, treadmills, exercise bikes. I mean, unless you live in London, England, or Seattle, somewhere it gets a bunch of rain, they don't make any sense to me. Do they make any sense to you?
Absolutely. I use an exercise bike because biking alongside cars is incredibly dangerous, or just biking in general, particularly if you're in the second half of life, is very dangerous. There are just so many injuries. People die falling off their bikes. Paul Gottfried fell off his bike and he was in hospital for 2 weeks. All sorts of people I know have had serious bike accidents. So just from a rational, self-regarding perspective, particularly if you're in the second half of life, particularly if you're in an urban area, it makes far more sense to bike on a stationary bike than to bike on the street. So I watch many movies and sporting events and TV shows and documentaries when I'm biking on my stationary bike. And when I date someone who goes outside and bikes and she's biking down busy streets, I know how much, as a driver, how much I hate bicyclists on the road. And it tears me up inside that someone I love is, in my mind, being so careless with her well-being. I mean, I care about this woman, and that she's biking along Santa Monica Boulevard absolutely kills me. And I think you're about 50 years of age. If you're out there on a physical bike or just riding a motorcycle, yeah, I think you are taking a sizable risk with your health.
Yeah, I only told you like part of the truth when you caught the fact that I was blaming my dogs for the fact that I'm not back in the gym right now. That's only partially true. I swam all through July, and by the end of July, my right, I don't know where my shoulder meets my arm, it would just burn. It would just burn, and I don't know. What's the point staying in shape if you can't even hold your arm up after afterwards? So I had taken like 30 or 45 days off. And then now I'm having to walk the dogs in the woods with a cane, with a walking cane. It feels stupid, but I've got one of my tendons or ligaments or nerves or something, somewhere between mile 1 and mile 3. It gives out. And I can't even track the genesis of why it happens. It's just, as we get older, things like that happen. So I was sort of, go ahead.
I think it's usually more important how you work out than what you work out. So you were working out, you were swimming in a way that caused you considerable physical damage, and you may well have been better off not swimming at all. If the way that you exercise causes you physical harm, usually you'd be better off not exercising. So people tend to think in ends-oriented ways. I'm going to go work out, and they don't tend to pay much attention to how they work out. And how you do things is often more important than what you're doing. So if you are working out and you start getting aches and pains, you need to address that right away. You need to figure out which of your habits is causing this problem, and then which exercises and techniques that you need to employ to ameliorate the problem. So whenever I get an ache and a pain and I don't understand what's going on, I immediately research it, usually just through YouTube videos, and I find workouts that will address the issue. For example, I will get lower back pain unless I do certain exercises, and I will get other aches and pains unless I do certain exercises. So I found a device that's called an activator. It's a chiropractic instrument, but I bought the $150 book that talks about how you use the device. And when I get aches and pains, this simple device of applying it just does a vast amount of benefit to me, so much so that I haven't had to go to regular physical therapy for about 8 years since I've started applying this device. So if we're not careful, right, our habits will become so self-destructive, and by working out, we will often ingrain bad habits more deeply. And so we're often doing more harm when we go to yoga or when we swim or when we bike or when we run than if we hadn't done them at all. And so the key is to deconstruct those habits that are causing you harm and figuring out more appropriate ways to work out that are more harmonious for your body. And when aches and pains come up anyway, despite the best of your efforts to stop self-destructing in your workout, then you have to address those problems right away, because if you don't address them, they tend to get worse. And then if you can't figure it out, you need to have the resources to go get help from a great physical therapist who can point out what's going on and can show you things that you don't see. Because I find that it's so much more helpful to have experts that I can turn to. For example, instead of pulling my hair out about a computer problem, I got various people that I can pay $100 or $150 an hour to get help, rather than banging my head for hours trying to figure something out. So too with my body. If I start to get a problem, I address it right away so that I don't end up in the situation you described. And for probably most Westerners, particularly in the second half of life, going to yoga, for example, is more likely to do them harm than to do them benefit. I remember the first few weeks that I did yoga, I did permanent damage to myself. I had to spend thousands of dollars in physical therapy to try to ameliorate the damage. And I noticed many people, they take up working out and they get some very difficult problems such as you just described. And how you work out is usually more important than what you do or whether you do a workout.
And the stretching. When I was running every day, to stretch. But now I've been getting older. The days are getting cooler. We're starting out the days in the 30s, some mornings. And I don't know, my ligament, my tendon, something, something, I tweaked it. And it's one of those things in that bundle that runs from like your foot all the way up the back of your leg. And it makes you mad when you give your foot a commandment. Walk, damn it. We just got to get back to the car, and your leg's going, I ain't going to do it. It does its own thing. Isn't that weird? You ever given your body a commandment and it disobeyed?
Yes. I mean, it's very common. For example, anyone who's listening to this, they should get video or have someone watch when they sit down. And invariably, despite the best of their efforts, they will tighten and constrict their lower back, which would lead to all sorts of problems. Just sitting down, there is almost inevitably a tightening and constricting of the lower back. I do it too, though it's not nearly as dramatic as it is with most people. So there's something far more important than stretching, and that is releasing muscles that are in unnecessary tension. So when muscles often get caught and they're overly tense, then I find something called positional release highly effective, in addition to a massage gun and the activator. But just using positional release, putting myself in certain positions to release the muscular strain, then frees up those muscles much more effectively than stretching, because stretching is not going to release the muscles that are in spasm. So finding the muscles that are in spasm and releasing the spasm, which I find incredibly beneficial, far more than stretching. Stretching, I think, is usually highly ineffective compared to more effective techniques such as positional release. It's also called strain, counter strain.
Yes. While you were getting right with God this week and observing your holy days, I found a young version, sort of Amy Wax. We've talked about it before. Yeah. She's almost like a man trapped in a woman's body. But I would offend her by saying that. And she is a woman, but she has such manly thinking. You know what I'm talking about. There's a young lady named Aydin Paladin. And she used this term in a little podcast this week called pivo. And let me lay this on you because it has to do with Israel, apparently, is the prime example of this. She called it perpetual in-group victimhood orientation. Academia. Or PIVO. You ever heard such a term?
Yeah, it's also, I mean, there are similar terms, pre-traumatic stress disorder, where you have such a strong in-group identity that you are just primed for a victimhood mentality. And it's often a useful mentality to have because it increases in-group social connection, but it will often come at the cost of your relations with outgroups.
From what you're describing, you didn't grow up in the Black community, but Black women sometimes have a warlike quality to them, especially the ones that have got kids to raise and they're not looking for a man. You know what I mean? They've kind of gone beyond that. Maybe they're fat or whatever. Very warlike. You don't want to get between them and the 2 gallons of milk they need for their kids.
Well, another way of saying that in a more neutral way is that Black Americans tend to exhibit a stronger in-group identity than white Americans.
Mm-hmm. What's your chances? We're getting close. Before I get off here, what's your chances of the civil unrest? You like the 10 scale, so lay it on me. Any kind of unrest? Are you foretelling anything at this point?
Yeah, I think there will be unrest, but I don't think it will ever threaten to go into civil war. I don't think there's any prospect of a civil war. And I suspect it probably won't be nearly as much unrest as unleashed by the Weather Underground, or as we saw in the late 60s, early 1970s. But we could have the equivalent of Black Lives Matter after George Floyd died. And I think we'll have something like the Ferguson effect if Trump wins. If Trump loses, I think the social disorder will be considerably diminished, because overwhelmingly Republicans and conservatives don't put the same priority on politics as do people on the left.
10-4. One thing that you don't agree with me on is I see young, straight, white dudes. They got to be coming to the reckoning that the corporate world's basically telling them they need not apply. Now you think everybody can, be great or whatever, but I'm telling you, unless they truly are great, I think white straight dudes probably think there's a glass ceiling there. So I don't know that I think of high chance for revolution. Maybe the culture is just so neutered at this point that there's nothing in them that would revolt. I'd still told you, like I told you a few months ago, I'd tend to lean more to some sort of a national divorce, but I wouldn't even know what that looked like. What would you even compare that to? I wouldn't even know what that would look like. I just know that California values, Illinois values, New York values, they ain't the same as the rest of the country. So I don't even know how that would break apart. It would just
right. There's no coherent way for America to split up. I just don't see any possibility. I certainly don't believe that everybody can be great. Only great people can be great. I do believe that if you've got a 120 IQ or a 115 IQ, no matter what race or religion you are, that you should be able to build a prosperous life in America, unless you've got some self-destructive addiction operating in your system.
Mm-hmm. And one other misconception I think you have, and it's maybe not be your misconception, it's just one of the areas of our prickle and gooness where we differ, is you think the media is basically there to inform you. And I think
no, I never ever said that. I said it's a business, and that it's good in some things, such as the score of a sporting event, and it's not so accurate in other things.
Right. Super Bowls happen. World Series happens. Tornadoes happen. Hurricanes happen. Things do happen. Wild rampage shooters do happen. But yeah, so maybe we are more in agreement. You agree with me that they look at grander narratives and they're more about controlling the masses more so than informing the masses. They'll lie to us 365 days of the year if they need to. But good. Well, I thought that was one area that we were in disagreement. It's just that sometimes when you're talking about the Mark Halperins or whatever, I can sense an angst in your voice, as if you feel like they're there to inform you, on these network TVs. But you do see beyond that. My bad. And I want to bid you a good day, my friend.
Okay, Kip. Good to talk to you. And Mark Halperin is no longer the ABC News political director. He is an independent creator, and I think he does the best job that he can, being fair and balanced. Doesn't mean that he always is, but I think he does a pretty good job. But I don't expect everyone to be perfectly fair and balanced. I don't expect myself to be perfectly fair. I recognize that humanity is inevitably flawed, and I recognize that different people have different hero systems, and we all operate under different incentives. And so I like to understand, what incentives are driving people.
Real problems. There are more and more countries who are saying, we're not going to ship you weapons anymore. You have the U.S. doing, I don't have.
So what's going to primarily determine Israel's international standing? Will it be its observance of international humanitarian law, or will it be its effectiveness? If other nations see benefits from allying with Israel because Israel is incredibly effective in some things, has technology and methods that another country wants to use, then the country other countries are going to follow their self-interest. So I don't think that Israel's standing in the world is going to be primarily dependent upon their observance of international humanitarian law.
I don't feel like it's has much credibility, but this letter from the State Department saying basically like you got to shape up with regard to aid, or there may be consequences. They're already sending signals that like no, actually there won't be consequences. But the U.S. sending that letter, I mean, it is something. And certainly the Netanyahu government is fearful that if Kamala Harris were elected or even post-election, that Biden might feel he has a freer hand to take some sort of actions against them. But more to the point, we've seen businesses pulling out. We've seen Intel was supposed to go forward with some significant investment in the state that they backed down of. You have an incredible burden on society from these multiple wars that they're fighting and constantly trying to escalate. And you even had a letter from some 130 IDF members who said, no, if you don't go and get a hostage deal and bring home the hostages and have a ceasefire, like we're not doing this anymore. We're going to refuse to serve. So the cracks are certainly showing. And so it's not preposterous, this assessment from this individual, especially when you consider the numbers of Israelis who have said, yeah, I've thought about leaving.
Right. And the assessment they're talking about that Israel's societal collapse is imminent.
And I've taken some steps to investigate what that could look like.
Yeah. I mean, I just don't know what to make of all of these developments and what the Biden administration really will do after the election. They have multiple different opportunities about what to do and which policy. You know, for example, the Obama administration allowed some critical resolutions against Israel to go through the UN Security Council after the election when Trump was coming into office during the transition. So they could take that. But I mean, all signs don't currently indicate that right now. I really don't know which way it's.
All right, let's get more analysis here from the Council on Foreign Relations.
Foreseeable future
well, I want to talk about, kind of Israel's strategy in a minute, but Bruce, just quickly, and then I want to go to Ed on this. Given the importance of Sinwar in both the military and political capacities, how challenging is it for Hamas to replace him? And does the organization kind of continue to remain unified under new leadership to continue the struggle?
Well, even if they do replace him and his brother Mohammed is one of the leading contenders, given Israel's success, and obviously the success has come from human intelligence as well as sophisticated technological means. I mean, how long? What's his longevity like? His actuarial table doesn't look very good compared to the other leaders of Hamas. And let me just finish on one point so we can move on. It's often said there's not a military solution to terrorism. That's not true. There's very rarely a military solution. That is entirely accurate. But if you were willing to kill tens of thousands of civilians, as Israel has been willing to, if you were willing to decapitate almost the entirety of a terrorist organization,
I would expect a nation state to pursue its self-interest. And if to secure its own safety, it needs to kill tens of thousands of enemy civilians, I would expect it to do so.
You could pretty much destroy it. And there is precedence for that. In 2008, the Sri Lankan armed forces, completely oblivious to international outcries over humanitarian concerns over at least the 40,000 Tamils civilians that were believed to be killed, destroyed the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam and killed its leader, Velaplai.
Yes, you can kill your way to ending a terrorist organization. It's been done before.
Provocateur and the entire leadership. And that was a similarly international and entrenched terrorist group that has not arisen. I don't foresee exactly the same scenario in Israel and Palestine or in Gaza. But Israel now is faced with this choice, whether to push on with what Netanyahu, I'm sure, will see as an historic opportunity to deal a crushing blow to or at least to hope to deal a crushing blow to a terrorist group, or does he stop? From my perspective, I don't see why he would stop, but I guess we'll see about that.
Okay.
Right. Why would Bibi stop when he's on such a winning run right now?
Ed, let's pick up on that, on the kind of future of Hamas. Could someone like, we talk about the brother. Could someone like Khalid Mashal steer Hamas away from the Iranian axis towards a more diplomatically inclined future? There's been some talk about that. Or with Hamas, kind of potentially weakened in Gaza, is there like a rebranding of Islamist movements in the Palestinian territories as kind of new leadership emerges? Could the group splinter into more radical factions or even kind of inspire similar movements around the region?
Thank you, Elise, for your question, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. In the last 2 hours,
I heard an observation that Barack Obama had an attitude towards Iran that's very common in Chicago politics, and that is if you're dealing with a fearsome thug, try to buy him off. And so that's essentially the Chicago politics style under Democrats over the past few decades. It was the Barack Obama administration's attitude towards Iran, and it's been the Joe Biden attitude towards Iran. Here is a dangerous thug. Let's try to buy them off.
has made a broadcast from Gaza for about 6 minutes, which has been repeatedly played on Al Jazeera out of Qatar, to explain Hamas's next move. So we've already seen Hamas move towards someone inside Gaza as the voice, as the leader, as the spokesperson, rather than someone such as Khalid al-Mish'al out of Doha in Qatar. Khalid al-Mish'al may be respected in Iran and may be respected in Qatar, but he doesn't enjoy popular command inside Gaza. And the Israelis want to be able to deal with someone inside Gaza, as will Israel, America, and our Arab allies on the day after the war. It's worth bearing in mind that while we in the West want to put a lot of pressure on Israel to come to some kind of truce or ceasefire, Khalil al-Hayya this morning went out of his way, because it's Friday prayers in the Middle East, millions are out praying, then it will be Shabbat, as most of our participants know, later today, over tomorrow. So his message is the following, that Hamas will not end the war. Hamas wants to see all Israeli soldiers withdraw from Gaza. Hamas will not release the hostages, and Hamas, as per its usual talking points, wants to have Jerusalem as its capital in a future Palestinian state. Now, we may say, well, those are just talking points, so we can ignore them. I'd caution against that kind of ignoring, because the Western or the American insensitivity towards this had led to October 7th, that we don't take them seriously when they say that they want to kill more Jewish people, they want to kill more Israelis, and they want to kill Arabs and Muslims who get in the way. So Hamas is very, very direct in what it wants.
So you can argue that the Israeli right takes Arabs and Hamas and the Palestinians more seriously than the centrists and the left, who think that they can negotiate a settlement with them. Right? People on the Israeli right recognize that inside the heart of the Palestinians, they want to be free, they want to dominate their region, and they want the end of a Jewish state. And they will stop at nothing to pursue those aims.
So I would encourage us to think about, how do we place even more pressure on Hamas and its paymaster Iran, rather than a country, i.e. Israel in this case, facing an existential threat. And it's no longer just Bibi saying this anymore. We've had Hamas, after a whole year of being attacked, still wanting to continue Israel. We saw them lobbing rockets as late as October 7th of this year, never mind last year. A couple of other points, if I may, Elise.
See discussion of inflation in the chat. I noticed that I pay about 40% more for groceries now than I did when Donald Trump was in office.
Before, my friend and colleague Stephen shares his latest thoughts, the Hamas leadership now, trained under Yahya Sinwar, knows how much treasure, blood, and diplomatic capital Israel will put towards releasing the hostages. And we must not forget that Yahya Sinwar was a product of this kind of exchange back in 2011. In order to get the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit released, I think Israel, just over 1,000 Palestinian terrorists, among whom Yahya Sinwar was the most senior. So they've seen how much Israel is prepared to sacrifice. So their demand, Khalil al-Hayya this morning said, to release all Hamas or Palestinian prisoners. So that's part of what they want. And I think it's important that we in Washington, D.C., also push back against Hamas demands. Just 2 points and I'll finish. On October 7th of last year, Israel had very little respect in the eyes of its Arab allies and Arab enemies, because how could an advanced nation in the heart of the Middle East be forced to lose so much dignity, over 1,200 lives, terrorists killing 1,200 Israelis, but more to the point, taking so many hostages while Israel was asleep at the wheel? How was that possible, that they could just come over on paragliders and tractors? So Israel had to, over the last year, re-establish its deterrence and its credibility in the eyes of its Arab allies. And now it's done that. To be able to go and eliminate a Hamas leader in the presidential compound in Iran was, I think, a hugely impressive move. The walkie-talkie attacks, the pager attacks, and now removing Yahya Sinwar. That has allowed Israel to re-establish its credibility in the eyes of its Arab Muslim allies and enemies. But what remains is this, and this is my last point, is that all of this has been possible because of Iranian political military cover for Hamas and Hezbollah and others to operate. And it would be a mistake, I think, both on Israel's part and our part in Washington, D.C. and broader Western alliance of Israel, is to hold Israel back at this stage. Israel has no option other than to secure its existence by eliminating threats from inside Iran. What those threats look like, I don't know. But I am confident that the Israeli Prime Minister will not hold back from attacking Iranian assets that pose a threat to Israel in the next 15, 20, 30 years.
Okay, Stephen, let's pick up on that. I think you are, along with Ed and Bruce, in agreement that Israel is not going to negotiate any form of a deal. Is the goal now complete of eradication of Hamas influence in Gaza, though? And with this focus on military pressure, how does Sinwar's death impact the hostages? Could this, I would assume, certainly diminish their willingness to release hostages in favor of retaliatory actions, maybe, unfortunately, killing the remaining ones that are alive?
Yeah, thanks, Elise. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I'm glad you asked the question about the.
Yeah, so when you're focusing on the hostages, it just places Israel's leadership in an increasingly vulnerable position, as opposed to focusing on what's in the best interests of the Jewish state.
On that point, does another group does PIDGE or other groups gain more influence? Could we see the rise of new groups with similar ideologies now that Hamas is leaderless?
I defer to Bruce on the question of the viability of PIDGE or some other groups emerging. All a continuation of what we've seen so far, because the fight is still within the Israelis, and at least rhetorically, at the moment, Hamas isn't giving it up.
Okay, hold on for 1 second, because I want to talk about the wider strategy. But Bruce, what do you think of this idea of the future of Palestinian resistance? Would Hamas lose its grip on Gaza? Would other groups such as Islamic Jihad gain more influence? Could we see, a kind of struggle there, particularly in Gaza, but in the wider Palestinian territories, of groups seeking influence and kind of favor with Iran?
Well, none of
So I've seen pro-Israel social media accounts saying that that there are now signs among the Palestinians that they genuinely want peace with Israel, that you have kids in Gaza waving Israeli flags and saying shalom to Israeli soldiers. So just as the United States bombed Japan into submission, dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan at the end of World War II, and then transitioned to a friendly relationship with Japan, right? Israel, through sufficient force, might well be able to convince Palestinians that a campaign of terror is not in their self-interest. That's certainly the hope of many on the Israeli side.
None of them were Hamas. None of them had the financial power, had the political throw weight, or had the fighters they could mobilize. So in Palestine, Islamic Jihad isn't the only faction there. And that, of course, is one of the enormously complicating factors with the hostages, is Hamas was not holding all of them. Popular Front for Liberation Palestine is active there. Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine General Command. These are dinosaurs from the Cold War that have reemerged and saw opportunity when the fence was breached to sort of elbow themselves in a very minor fashion onto the limelight. But I think this goes to the heart of what October 7th was about and how it impacted Israel. And there's a parallel to 9/11, or September 11th, 2001. Prior to then, terrorism was seen as a tactical threat, as something that tragically killed people, but did not have strategic or even existential implications. We woke up to the fact that on September 11th, that terrorists at least have an intentionality of exerting some existential, dealing a knockout blow to their enemies if it was all within their realm. And as we saw in the United States, counterterrorism crossed the realm from being a tactical concern to being a strategic one. I would argue that's the same thing that's happened in Israel. So for their point of view, having to deal with a myriad of smaller, less capable, less well-organized, and mostly apolitical. That was one of Hamas's strengths, is that it was a political organization, also a social welfare organization. None of the other resistance, quote-unquote, resistance factions on the ground in Gaza have anything like those capabilities. So from Israel's perspective, dealing with an atomized terrorist groups, well, that was the way counterterrorism has been for, 40 or 50 years in Israel. Hamas was the one who emerged to pull everyone together and succeed on October 7th, given that that capability has now been, at least indefinitely, or at least for the foreseeable future, taken away from Hamas and therefore from the quote-unquote resistance groups or terrorist groups in Gaza. That's not an undesirable outcome, rather, from the Israeli point of view. And let's be clear, and I think Stephen can perhaps amplify this because he was most recently in Israel. But, polling has regularly shown 2/3 of Israelis, at least 2/3, do not favor right now a 2/3 solution. That somewhere in the vicinity of 3/4 of Israelis believe that a Palestinian state would create more terrorism, not less.
We're opposed to a revitalized Palestinian Authority administering the Gaza Strip for all of those reasons.
Ed, what do you think? Talk about the future of the PA, and then we're going to open it up. I think we have a question online. What does the future of the Palestinian kind of governance look like in Gaza?
The PA's greatest enemy is not Israel. The PA's greatest enemy is Hamas. The PA absolutely loathes the presence of Islamist organizations, and yes, at least the factions within it. Mahmoud Abbas's son leading one faction, Hussein al-Sheikh leading another faction. But I think the foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates put it best when he recently said that the PA is operating as Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, and it's uncharacteristic of a senior Arab diplomat to put it in those terms, but that was what was leaked out of a meeting that he had with other GCC leaders. But I just want to say a couple of other things, if I may, Elise, very quickly, and then we can open up. What is to say that for Gaza to become Dubai, it needs its own Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid or Sheikh Zayed, and we haven't seen that kind of humble, wealth distributing, kind, compassionate leadership. We just haven't. My old boss, Tony Blair, used to say that politics is part performance, part philosophy, and part delivery.
That is a great summary of politics: part performance, part philosophy, part delivery.
On the part of the Palestinian leadership, we haven't seen part delivery or a clear part philosophy. We've just seen performance, rocking up in Arab capitals and performing from Yasser Arafat until now. So unless there are those significant changes in leadership, philosophy.
Right. There has not been a track record of Palestinian organizations delivering in the best interests of their people.
Performance and delivery, we won't see a Dubai and Gaza emerge without the emergence of a Mohammed bin Rashid type figure and an entrepreneurial population that isn't full of hatred, and its own identity isn't anti-Jewish, isn't all about destroying Israel, but about building itself. And I think those are the bigger philosophical shifts that need to take place inside Gaza. And the last point I wanted to make is this, and I think it's really important for us to appreciate where Gaza is on the map and the significance of Egypt, 100, 110 million people next door. While we've had, entirely positive, by and large, comments in the public discourse out of the Gulf Arab countries, we've had the total opposite out of Egypt. So just yesterday, the greatest religious figures inside Egypt, Ahmed al-Tayyib at Al-Azhar, has been applauding the so-called martyrdom operations and the resistance culture. And I think we should be seriously concerned when you have leadership of 110 million people across the border from Gaza applauding the resistance, applauding a martyrdom culture, applauding suicide bombings, applauding jihad, and applauding the elimination of the state of Israel, and what that means for Israeli concerns about their own security, and therefore Hamas feeling, and PIJ and other organizations, that they actually have support across the border, with Egypt and then further along with Iran and elsewhere. So I just don't think, I think we should be really worried about the direction of travel in the Middle East.
All right, you're probably wondering, what the heck does John Podhoretz think about the significance of the Sinwar killing?
The brains behind Hamas had been killed, and indeed, of course, Yahya Sinwar is dead. And I would submit, I'm just going to throw this out and then have you react to it. I put this on Twitter yesterday. Yesterday was one of the most important days of the 21st century. Is that an overstatement? I'll defend it, but...
Okay, one of the most important days of the 21st century. For whom? Right, I don't think for the average American, the death of Sinwar makes that much of a difference. But for those with an intense Jewish identity, it is a monumental occasion.
But I want to see how you guys react to it.
Well, so it was a great day, but I think I'm in the minority here today, as I was yesterday. I am very cautious of what I would call the personalist fallacy in counterterrorism, which is the idea that one person's death will solve everything. And while I take Abe's point in his excellent piece on the website yesterday, that when you whack all the moles, you win the game. So if you do eliminate all the terrorists, then you have won. I'd be very cautious of putting too much on killing the person of Sinwar. This was the same logic that informed the Obama administration's counterterrorism strategy after the death of bin Laden in 2011. And because bin Laden was killed in the raid, the Obama administration believed, well, that's it. The war can now come to an end. We removed all of our troops from Iraq at the end of 2011, that same calendar year. And what happened? Well, ISIS came and the war continued and we were back into the Middle East. So I would just say it was a wonderful, great day. More needs to be done, but I don't know if it would rank at the most important days.
Okay, so my argument is that something happened that is of inestimable importance in the middle of what I think has been a decade-long crisis of legitimacy for democratic leaders across the globe, which is that on October 7th or on October 8th, Israel, in the person of Bibi Netanyahu, but I think it was a national view that stretched, across the entire body politic, said, Hamas must be destroyed, Sinwar must die, we must take out this threat to us. And a year and 10 days later, that goal has, if it has not been fully achieved, because not, because I mean, when we won World War II, it wasn't like there were German, there was a German counterinsurgency that faced our troops in Western Europe after VE Day. So there will be such a thing.
Well, and you left out one of the goals,
okay.
John. Yeah. The other goal was get the hostages back.
Right. Okay, but that's why. Okay, so get to that, but let me. So the larger point is, Israel said we are going to destroy Hamas. Israel had said it before. Bibi Netanyahu said this in 2014 when the first real major war between Israel and Hamas took place. There had been smaller, conflicts in 2009 and 2011, but that was a war. And Bibi said we're going to destroy Hamas, and guess what? Hamas was not destroyed, and in fact, there were other incursions between 2014 and 2023. And while those were going on, Hamas was constructing the underground tunnel city right under Israel's nose without Israel's knowledge. Israel said, we are going to do this thing. Maybe it's not entirely done, but it's 80 to 90.
So in 2011, right, Bibi Netanyahu gave up over 1,000 Hamas terrorists to get one lousy Israeli soldier back, Gilad Shalit. And he did this because there was just overwhelming political pressure. Think about how much pressure Bibi Netanyahu has been under for the past year to compromise on his war against Gaza. He has stood up to an unbelievable amount of pressure, and he seems to have become increasingly vindicated by the events of the past month, climaxing now with the killing of Sinwar. So in 2011, Bibi could not stand up against overwhelming political pressure. Now there's been considerable pressure on Bibi to compromise the mission in Gaza, but the pressure has come from a minority of the population. Israel has learned how dangerous and destructive and self-defeating it is to exchange over 1,000 Hamas terrorists for one lousy Israeli hostage. And I don't think the majority of Israelis want to engage in that same sort of self-defeating behavior. So Bibi Netanyahu has a grandiose vision of himself. Donald Trump has a grandiose vision of himself, but this grandiose vision, this optimally irrational vision, has enabled these two men to stand up to levels of pressure that 99.999% of politicians could never stand up to.
90% done. And for once in the last 10 years, the democratically elected leader of a Western democracy.
And the chat says, I've stopped making new friends online. What are you doing, Luke Ford? How did you find Kip? I try to produce shows that optimize for truth, and I get some fellow travelers. One thing that I've been doing is releasing shorts. And so shorts get a lot more views than longer form videos. So more people are exposed to my thoughts and the thoughts of people that I highlight on my shows. And then that expands my subscribers. So over the past 6 months, I've gotten an extra 1,100, 1,200 subscribers to my main channel, and I've gotten an extra approximately 700, 800 subscribers to my other YouTube channels because I've done the hard work of producing shorts. And I reply to everyone who sends me a thoughtful message about something that I discuss on the show.
Has fulfilled his promise to retard, reverse, and fight off an evil and do something to defend and advance the interests of his country. And that Israel's the smallest of these democracies and arguably the most threatened, but also the most outsized in term relative to its population and its strategic position. So that's why I think it's, in that sense,
so I think
enormously important.
I think you could say that in the context of the war, of what's happened over.
So as you get older as a man, you get hair in inconvenient places, such as nose hair. And I really don't like nose hair when my face is public so often. So I use an electric shaver to get rid of some of them. And then on an individual basis or even on a group basis, I go in there with tweezers and just tweeze them out. And then I also use the electric shaver to run over the sides of my ears and to get into my ears where I don't want ear hair and also get in there with tweezers to pluck them out. So that's how I get rid of the unsightly nose and ear hair. Answering a question in the chat.
Over the past few weeks, between the attack that killed Nasrallah and now the accidental encounter with Sinwar that led to his demise, is the equivalent of the Battle of Gettysburg or the Battle of Midway, a turning of the tide. I would endorse that 100%, but it's not over. As long as the Iranian regime...
So when I have a visitor, all right, I do extra cleanup and preparation for having a visitor. And in a sense, you are my visitor. All right, I probably take a little bit more care with my appearance and getting rid of that nose and ear hair because I'm going public. So we're profoundly influenced by the people around us and people around us who we don't know, right? If we are at all self-interested, we want to present ourselves in certain ways. And self-presentation is important, right? The idea just come across as you are is not usually a useful strategy.
It remains in place. These networks will have the resources to reconstitute themselves and rebuild and wage war against Israel. Now, that's a longer-term challenge. There are ways in which we can deal.
Yeah, ear hair is a lot more difficult than nose hair. And I remember sometimes after the first time I've slept with a woman, before she even lights up a cigarette, could you help me with this little bit of ear hair or with this grooming issue? Do you think I should throw out these shirts? That's the great thing about having a woman in your life. She can guide you on all sorts of matters of personal grooming and self-presentation. Though you need to have some basic level of mastery to be able to have a woman in your life.
With that, it's not going to happen overnight. But I'm saying that it's a long-term conflict. And also, I'm very, very alarmed, as usual, with the administration's response.
So almost all the Israeli political elites were for compromising the war on Hamas to try to get the hostages back. And as opposed to almost all the other Israeli political elites, it appears that Bibi Netanyahu has proven himself the more courageous and the more far-seeing and the more effective.
That we have reporting now that Biden told Netanyahu in a phone call from Air Force One while Biden was on his way to Germany to end the war. Now's the time to end the war. You got what you want. You got Sinwar. Let's make a deal. Again, thinking that it's Israel that is the obstacle to a deal.
So I'm featured in a new Daily Caller documentary on the pornography industry. And I bought a 1-month subscription to check myself out. And I was getting ready to clip highlights from my presentation. And then I saw how I looked. I thought, like, that old wrinkled man, I'm not clipping this. I have no desire to clip this. Perhaps there may be more flattering lighting, or maybe I just saw a reality that I hadn't seen so clearly. Because when I saw my old wrinkled self in the Daily Caller documentary, I lost all desire to clip it for my YouTube channel.
Okay. So just two quick things. The terms on which Israel began the war of October, that it responded to the war that began October 7th. Its terms were, we are destroying Hamas. The question of how to deal with the axis of resistance, or whatever you want to call the Iranian seven-front assault on Israel, that was not that the goals and aims of the conflict that began on October 7th for Israel were targeted specifically to removing, extirpating, and destroying Hamas in Gaza and returning to the state of deterrence that Israel had against, in this border area. The larger question of whether or not Israel can secure a genuinely lasting peace in the region goes to Iran, but that was not the stated goal. So that's why I say it's not Midway and it's not Gettysburg. First of all, Midway was the first victory in the battle in the Pacific. Like it was a tide turning, but it was also like the moment at which the Americans got their sea legs. And I don't think that analogy holds here. But to get it to stretch it out a little further, you, I think, rightly said, this was one of the things that was amazing about this attack, Eli, is that it was an ordinary group of, trainees learning how to be tank commanders. They were in a depopulated area. They saw some movement in a house and they fired a rocket and somebody was injured, and they send the drone in. The drone sees this guy who throws a stick at him, and then he's taken out. So was this accidental? Well, it's an accident that comes after a year of war that leads precisely to the conditions in which the head of Hamas is sitting in some weird empty house in where I don't think we quite know where it was, because I don't think they've said where exactly it was. And that is the opportunity, is the result of the war. The opportunity that is who got Sinwar means it didn't have to be an intelligence triumph. It didn't have to be a technological breakthrough like the beeper attack. It was something that happened in the course of the war that had been fought successfully to at least this climactic moment in which an ordinary group of grunts gets Hitler.
Well,
that's it. Okay.
It's extremely important because of the enemy that the story of Sinwar's humiliating demise is spread far and wide among Palestinian and the wider kind of Arab population, because we're already seeing an effort to try to say he died in the field fighting the bad guys, and that Palestinian martyrs, they will live forever. It goes back to the martyrdom of Izzadin al-Qassam, which Hamas reveres. And this is the story. The real story is that the dreaded Yahya Sinwar, who tormented not only Israelis but of course Palestinians, died in a rubbleized building with 5 passports, a wad of cash, what appears to be making his way to Egypt to flee. It's very important that that story is understood and internalized by Palestinians, because that's the moment where you can begin to maybe see what you want is a breaking of the will, saying, listen, fundamentalism, jihad, resistance is getting us nowhere. Look at the death of Yahya Sinwar, to quote Trump, when he said of Baghdadi, he died like a dog. It's very important that lots of people, Palestinians sort of see that this path is nothing but catastrophe. That maybe opens up a political opportunity for something different. Because what we had before, long before October 7th, the dynamic was that, the corrupt, autocratic Fatah, the alternative to Hamas, was increasingly aping and mimicking Hamas. After October 7th, Palestinian Authority pretty much said it was a wonderful act of resistance, and they defended it. They were following Hamas's lead. This is an opportunity now, especially if it's good that there's so much video of this, and there's so many photographs of this. Get the story of Sinwar out far and wide and make it clear. He was, he died like a Whitey Bulger on the run. He died like a dog, like the rat king that he is.
And if we can talk about, supernatural.
Who is this hurting on the other side of the screen? Who are the people that are watching this monthly, weekly, daily?
My name's Noah Church, and people know me for the most part because I'm willing to speak about my experiences as a younger man and as a child too, growing up under the influence of internet pornography. I was probably 9 or 10 when I first had the idea to search online for pictures of pretty ladies, and I found that, and I found a lot more than I ever imagined I would find, of course. And from that first search, I was hooked. It was a rush. It felt very compelling, and it kept me coming back.
Starting about age 8, I spent a good deal of it in romantic fantasies, and then sexual fantasies, and then fantasies about having power. And then one day, I got exposed to pornography, and I suddenly felt alive in a way that I'd never felt alive before. My whole soul lit up, and nothing that I ever experienced before seeing a naked woman, which was 3rd grade, compared to that experience of seeing a naked woman. I felt alive.
I started dating my abusive boyfriend when I was just...
I looked at that and thought, what the hell? Who's that old man? I don't want to clip that guy. All right, back to the Commentary Magazine podcast on the death of Yahya Sinwar.
Interpretations of an event like this. He died with the initial attack on him, that we then saw the drone reveal his body.
Right.
He died with his arm severed. Who else had his arm severed? Hersh Goldberg Poland had his arm severed on October 7th and was driven away in that golf cart with the Hamas terrorists and survived until he was killed to protect Sinwar from discovery.
We know the story.
We're dealing with something that is so intensely desired by a substantial part of the male population that doesn't have a woman that it doesn't really matter.
We know the story.
We're dealing with something that is so intensely desired by a substantial part of the male population that doesn't have a woman that it doesn't really matter how bad it is. So if you are desperate and you are just driven, if the most intense hour of your day is looking at pornography, are you going to be changed by all these studies that say it's bad for you? No. Just like if the most important hour of your day is when you smoke or drink or play video games or whatever your compulsion is.
As it changes the social sexual norm.
Okay, let's get back. That's from the Daily Caller. It's documentary on the pornography industry. Let's get back to Commentary Magazine podcast on the death of Sinwar.
In the tunnels at the end of September. And the message to me is pretty astoundingly clear. An arm for an arm and a death for a death. And Rachel Goldberg Poland and her husband John Poland at least have achieved a measure of justice in the killing of Sinwar. Grim justice, but justice that would seem to be a direct message to them from whatever force there is in the I would define it more broadly, but more generally or more specifically than that. But I will forbear from doing so.
Can we speak about another message that was revealed to have been utterly, as we discussed at the time, utterly incomprehensible and actually immoral? And that's the message of the Biden administration a few months ago, just saying we should not go into Israel should not go into Rafah. The scolding, the hectoring from Biden, from Blinken, from Jake Sullivan, from Kamala Harris, who went out yesterday and delivered a perfectly decent statement, but a statement that should have had an asterisk on it that said, none of this would have happened if Bibi Netanyahu had followed America's, hectoring advice about Rafah. He was found in the very place that Israel was constantly told by the United States, its ally, not to go into. And I think her attempt to look presidential and to have her sort of bin Laden is dead moment falls flat if people don't remember that context, because that was pretty recent. I know people don't remember what happened 2 weeks ago, never mind 6 months ago, but it is really important, on top of what Matt mentioned about what Biden had told Netanyahu just yesterday, really important to understand that this happened in spite of America, not because of its support.
Right. But Jake Sullivan came out, excuse me, and said this was done with American help. It is through our cooperation and intelligence sharing that Israel was able to do this. Yeah.
Can we take a moment on
and other high-level targets.
Yeah. Can we take a beat to quote the woman from White Women for Kamala? Can we take a beat? Jake Sullivan, Antony Blinken, these people represent, from I think a commentary reader's perspective, the best possible people on national security and foreign policy for a Democratic administration. And they have been the pits. Well, they have been the worst. Every time they make the wrong decision.
This is a very important point you're making. And
it's such an important point.
It's such an important point, but it's so important that it's obscuring the fact that apparently you crashed the White Women for Kamala Zoom, Eli.
Yeah,
Well, I didn't quite realize that.
It's all about how you identify.
I want to hear more about
totally
that
fine.
later. But your point is very true, and it dovetails with something I learned, or I watched a lecture that by the Stanford historian, the Hoover Institution historian, Stephen Kotkin, Stalin's biographer, the other day.
Great writer, by the way.
One of my lodestars.
Yeah.
And Kotkin made the point that, okay, Harris v. Trump. Trump wins. It's the second Trump administration. If Harris wins, it's actually the fourth Biden administration. Right?
Or the fourth Obama administration?
That's what I mean. The fourth Obama administration. Sorry, it's early. We're recording this early.
Yeah.
It's the fourth Obama administration. And what is the trend line in all administrations? Downward. So the second administration is always worse than the first. The Biden administration, which is the third Obama term, has been terrible. So if this is the baseline, if this is the best case, as Eli says, from our perspective, and it's been completely disappointing and maddening the whole time, imagine what Obama's fourth term in the person of Kamala Harris might look like.
Okay, I want to talk about the Biden saying it's time to end the war, and Abe, to get to what you were writing about whacking the moles, which you can read on the commentary.org website. Abe's post yesterday is giving America a whistle. Go help us negotiate getting the hostages.
Okay, pulled that clip in a little
A
early.
cruise, and Felix is of course annoying everybody and it being terrible, and the captain of the cruise gives Felix a whistle and says, okay, help us,
So this is John Podhoretz talking about the old TV show the Odd Couple. John Podhoretz is great with his pop culture references and showing how they illuminate various parts of our political discussion.
As an activities director, I'm giving you a whistle, and Oscar goes up to the captain and says, what are you, crazy? What are you giving him? This is terrible. You're encouraging him. And he said, I have a rule. When there's a troublemaker, I give him a whistle. So Bibi is giving Blinken a whistle. Bibi is giving America a whistle. Go help us negotiate getting the hostages back. You're the interlocutor with Qatar. Say whatever you want. I'm giving you the whistle. You got 2.5 weeks until the election. Go do something. Thanks a lot. Blow your whistle. Play with this toy over here in the corner while we, the grown-up.
John Podhoretz is so compelling as a social media commentator, and I don't particularly care for his neocon ideology, but I got to recognize his greatness in the medium.
Fight the war that you should be fighting against this anti-American, anti-Western, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel evil. And you're a nice boy, come from a nice rich family. You finally got to be Secretary of State. Everything you've said is stupid. Everything you do is annoying. Your foreign policy is terrible. But there you are. Go blow the whistle in the face of the Qataris, and we'll just keep sailing the ship where we're going.
All right. There is another thing that the United States can do. And John, you said this to me yesterday, but one of the details that came out of the Sinwar demise is that one of his bodyguards had an ID card that said he was a teacher for UNRWA, which is, I mean, listen, we already had all the evidence, but it's like this is the cherry on top of the sundae. End UNRWA. This is a serious political, diplomatic challenge that the United States could do that Israel can't possibly do alone. But the evidence is there. We have to rebuild Gaza. You can't have Gaza in rubble like this. So great, let's create a new agency or figure out some way. But UNRWA can no longer be in charge of this because they are so thoroughly corrupted and penetrated. And what other evidence do you have? One of Sinwar's henchmen, as he was fleeing Gaza, was an UNRWA teacher. That's all.
More important, Israel is on the verge of declaring UNRWA a terrorist organization, and therefore kicking it out of its headquarters in Israel, and removing all diplomatic immunity from all employees of UNRWA. So you're saying Israel can't do it alone? I think that kills UNRWA.
Well,
I don't know how UNRWA operates if the employees of UNRWA are viewed by the sort of host country, even though they're not really the host because they only operate in Gaza, but they administratively have to go in and out of Israel and all of that. Basically, Israel is destroying UNRWA from within.
That they can do that,
but to Matt's point,
they can't rebuild. They can't. You need another.
No, of course not. But to Matt's point, we would like it if the United States were on board with this.
They're not.
The United States, right? But we pulled out of
don't pass the law. They're telling
in the 1980s we pulled out of UNICEF because UNICEF was basically a support structure for terrorist organizations in Africa or totalitarian governments in Africa. And we said we're no longer, the United States is withdrawing its financial support and any logistical support and personnel from UNICEF. So there is actually a precedent to say we don't work with this UN agency. It's an evil. And of course, and the UN Human Rights Commission or whatever the Human Rights Council is that we pulled out of as well. And we can do it with UNRWA, right? But it is true that what is so maddening about the administration is it will not say we are going to levy sanctions on Iran and its oil production. Why? Because it's 2.5 weeks to the election. I was driving through New England over the last couple of days. Gas prices over New England are under $3. And anything happens, if there's a strike in Iran on, so apparently they're not allowed to strike the nuclear facilities. And if there were a strike against the oil facilities, there would be at least a momentary oil future shock of some sort, and oil prices would rise, oil futures would rise. right? So, and they're like, oh no, that means gas prices will go up 50 cents before the election. And that's the last thing. Well, all that does is remind people of inflation and all of that. We've got to keep Israel from doing that. And that is where Israel suddenly has the upper hand with the United States, which is the point I was trying to make. They know that this is a domestic consideration for Biden. If Israel has ambitious plans to do something major in Iran, that doesn't have to happen in the next 2 weeks because it can, again, pick time, manner, and place of its choosing, and it needs a victory, and it got the victory with Sinwar's death. They can say, okay, we're not going to do anything. Go get our hostages back. Go do something constructive. I mean, they won't say it in this tone, but go do something constructive. Get the hostages back. And you know what? After November 6th, it is kaboom time. And don't you open up a lip to us. Now, Biden and Harris will do whatever Biden and Harris want to do. But in terms of that, Israel now has the whip hand in saying, oh, you don't want us to help Trump get elected? How are we going to work together here? Because Bibi...
I have a theory, by the way, that they've already helped Trump get elected, because I've been, for another project for my next script, I've been going back and looking at, if you look at his elevator speech from 2015, he says over and over, we don't win wars anymore.
Speech.
The escalator, sorry, my bad. Yeah. We don't win wars anymore. What happened to winning wars? And I think Israel, in the process of winning a war, is a reminder of that part of the Trump message, which is sometimes interpreted by like Tucker and the isolationist right as end the forever wars. But it's actually, if you look at what he's saying, no, win wars. And that's what Israel is doing. So in a weird way, it's a reminder that we are not destined to be a country that wages forever wars and constantly pushes for
decline is a choice.
Decline is a choice.
Decline is a choice. We can win wars. We could take out the Iranian nuclear facilities 5 minutes after we finish taping this podcast.
Yep.
We have the bombers. We have the bombs. We have everything. This has been the fight between Israel and the administration for 15 years, which is Israel says we cannot live with a nuclear Iran. This cannot happen. And it's really going to be hard for us to take out Iran's nuclear facilities, if not impossible. But there may come a time at which we have to take the shot that we have to take. And we might only have a 50% chance of pulling it off. And then the world is on fire. And you, America, you have a 100% chance of success if you decide to do this. Your entire Air Force, the entire military of the United States is directed at high altitude bombing missions to use America's unique power to destroy things without risking American lives. You can do it in 5 seconds. Why don't you do it? Because if you do it, it'll happen. And if we do it, it might not happen. And I'm telling you right now, we may have to give it a shot. And that.
Okay, looking at the chat on Rumble, Coney Hawk says, I found your channel by searching for Lawrence Oster, who was Jewish, though he may have converted to Christianity before he died. He was also on the right. I only heard about Lawrence Oster from Gregory Hood's podcast. It's insane how many ideas are blacklisted online. Even Normie Breitbart is hidden on Google.
Argument is present right now, and we have this bizarre administration that, in its inconstancy, says it wants to work for Israel's defense or support Israel's defense, and then defines Israel's defense as being cower behind your borders, don't do anything outside your borders except these cool things that are kind of really cool and are out of a Daniel Silva novel, and we'll say that was kind of cool. Oh boy, was that cool! But don't do anything else.
By the way,
yeah, you're right.
You know who was right 15 years ago was your father, Norman Bedardz, who made this
as he was about everything. Yeah,
right. I'm just saying
he's
laid it out.
Still there, so it's yes.
He's still there, right? I'm saying he laid it all out. And he's absolutely right. And we are now at the point, this is an inflection point. It's
okay. So that's why I say maybe I should qualify what I said at the beginning of the podcast and say this could be one of the most significant. Yesterday could have been one of the most significant days of the 21st century. We'll know that in 3 months.
Yeah.
We'll know whether the history of the planet was altered by what happened yesterday because of what follows on from it. Maybe nothing follows on from it. Maybe simply the war in Gaza goes on. Israel continues to mop things up. The hostages remain there. Israel remains in a state of torture over the hostages.
So Israel, in exchange for following the Biden administration's directives of not hitting Iran's nuclear and oil facilities, is getting considerable help from America. At least 23 U.S. military flights have landed in Israel in recent days, providing the THAAD air defenses and possibly other military gear coming in to Israel ahead of its operation in Iran. Israel Security Cabinet convenes this evening. Will this be the final session before the order to strike Iran? It appears that all of the pieces are slowly falling into place. though the exact nature of Israel's plan of action still a mystery.
Hostages, Gutter doesn't do anything. Tony Blinken paints his nails. Jake Sullivan says more stupid stuff and celebrates his wife winning a congressional seat. Joe Biden sunsets at 4 p.m. and Kamala Harris cackles and shoots her Glock at Doug Emhoff for beating women up and impregnating.
In the direction of Doug. In the direction.
Do you believe that? Do you believe she has a Glock?
Wait, can we just add one more thing? One more thing.
I mean, John Podhoretz is so compelling because he's unafraid to hit below the belt.
One more thing to the fourth Obama term point that I think is important that Matt made earlier, and that's that the other thing we're not discussing about why the United States is not being tougher on Iran is that it, at the highest levels of the Biden administration, it has compromised our national security by putting people in place like Robert Malley and others who were, in fact, working with Iran and likely passing information to Iran about our plans. And so I think that the compromised State Department, the compromised anywhere where those people were, and some of them still are at very high security level positions, that needs to be looked at as well. And a change of administration would offer an opportunity to clean house in that regard too.
Okay, so let's move on to the news of last night. It's not really news, right? So last night was the night where Kamala Harris did not show up at the legendary...
I'm going to interrupt. I'm going to do a really bold interruption because I think before we talk about it, we do need to have one rule, and you guys completely disregard my rule about trying to do math on the podcast, fine. But this is a rule. No woman in her 60s should appear in a Catholic schoolgirl's uniform or in proximity to a woman in a Catholic schoolgirl's uniform. There, that's
a rule, but now we have to provide the context for why you're establishing this rule.
Because technically Harris did appear at the Smith dinner in a video feed because she refused to be there in person, and whoever on her campaign staff decided to do this should be fired. They got Molly...
Okay, New York Times is citing former right-wing radio host Charlie Sykes as a keen critic of the right. Stephen Miller writes on X, Charlie Sykes spent decades in Wisconsin as a low-rent Rush Limbaugh. He made hundreds of thousands of dollars writing books antagonizing conservatives, including on topics such as school choice. He made the black sheriff a national name and then turned around and accused him of being a Proud Boy. Charlie Sykes was a notorious philanderer around Wisconsin with multiple mistresses. Now he is simply writing it all off as one giant mistake when he was younger to keep his gigs going on MSNBC. He's now disavowing all of it because it will cost him dollars. Charlie Sykes is exactly how the Republican Party ended up at Donald Trump. Charlie Sykes and the rest of the Bulwark and Dispatch commentators such as Tim Miller have spent the last 5 years hoping that you didn't notice what was happening. So Charlie Sykes tweets about this New York Times story. Harris to court moderates with a one-time right-wing provocateur, Charlie Sykes. And Sykes tweets, breaking news, when I was younger and stupider, I actually said a number of stupid things. Thank God the New York Times is all over this critical story. I often bring up Charlie Sykes as the main character in a telling and prescient critique of talk radio, right-wing talk radio, how it's all about agitating people, that the powers that be are discriminating against them, but the radio host, he is fighting for you. And Charlie Sykes used to be the embodiment of that right-wing victimhood cliche.
Shannon, who I like, to revive her role as it's Mary Catherine
Gallagher.
Mary Catherine Gallagher, the Catholic schoolgirl. She is a
character she debuted some 35 years ago.
30 years ago as a kind of dippy Catholic schoolgirl who smells her own armpits and acts nervous. And Kamala Harris actually was supposed to be the straight man to the Mary Catherine Gallagher character. And it was a bomb. It bombed as well it should. So that's the context of the 60-year-old women in Catholic schoolgirl uniform rule.
Okay.
And then John Podhoretz says that that actress is a friend of mine. Skip.
Everybody is publishing pieces that said what I said yesterday on the podcast, which is that their closing argument is that Trump is insane, that he is senile, and that he is, dangerously untrustworthy because of his mental decline. Shows up at the Al Smith dinner, and yes, reading remarks that are written for him by comedians or whatever. Yes, there are right-wing comedians. Knocked it out of the park. He was, again, I am not a fan of the Trump humor bit thing. We've talked about this now for like 8 or 9 years. Abe, more of a fan, I would say, of the Trump as comedian. And would you care to provide a capsule review of Trump's work?
Oh well, yeah, I always
from the dais.
Oh yeah, he's like he reminds me of Alan King. I think he's great as a stand-up, as a deliverer of zingers. So this was. The atmosphere is perfect for him. I liked his ribbing of Chuck Schumer, attacking the.
What did he say? What did he say? He looks so grim.
Yeah, glum.
He looks so glum, sitting
and then,
so glum.
Then rubbed his shoulder. Then he reached out to his side and rubbed Chuck Schumer's shoulder, which Schumer must have loved. And he said, you know, it's okay, Chuck, with the way your party is, as woke as your party is, you can someday, if Kamala loses, although I noticed Trump kept saying Kamala no matter what. By the way, I don't think he says that to make a point. I just think that's the way he says her name.
You mean like 200 million people in Israel, excuse me, 200 people in India named Kamala?
Right.
And in Pakistan who are named Kamala? Like, she is the only person in the world who pronounces it Kamala, just so it is understood that
maybe that's the
Kamala
Canadian pronunciation.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Maybe that's when she was living in Canada. That's how she started Kamala.
So he said, it's okay, Chuck. If Kamala doesn't become president, as woke as your party is, you can still become the first female president.
Anyway, the great line.
So there was a terrific Mother Jones article back in 2008 about the talk radio playbook. So talk show hosts are popular and powerful because they appeal to a segment of the population that feels disenfranchised and victimized by the media. These people believe the media predominantly staffed by and consistently reflect the views of social liberals, which is true. This view is by now so long held and deeply rooted, it has evolved into virtually every conservative's DNA. To succeed, a talk show host must perpetuate the notion that his listeners are victims and the host is the vehicle by which they can become empowered. The host frames virtually every issue in us versus them terms. There has to be a bad guy against whom the host will emphatically defend these loyal listeners. The enemy can be a politician, either a Democratic office holder, or in rare cases where there's no convenient Democrat to blame, it can be a rhino, a Republican in name only, someone deemed not conservative enough. It can be the cold, cruel government bureaucracy. More often than not, however, the enemy is the mainstream media. In the talk radio business, this concept, which must be mastered to be successful, is called differentiating yourself from the rest of the media. It is a brilliant marketing tactic that has also helped Fox News Channel thrive. We report, you decide, and fair and balanced are more than savvy slogans. They are code words, signaling that only Fox will report the news in a way conservatives see as objective and truthful. Forget any notion, however, that talk radio talk shows are supposed to be fair, even-handed discussions featuring a diversity of opinions. The fairness doctrine, which required this, was repealed 30 years ago. So talk shows can be and are all about the host's opinions, analysis, and worldview. Programmers learned long ago that benign conversations led by hosts who present all sides of an issue don't attract large audiences. One entire group that rarely gets on the air are the elderly callers, unless they have something extraordinary to say. Sadly, that doesn't happen often. The target demo is 25 to 54. Talk show fans are not stupid. They will detect an obvious phony. The best talk show hosts sincerely believe everything they say. Their passion is real. Their arguments have been carefully crafted in a manner they know will be meaningful to the audience and that validates the views these folks are already thinking. Smart talk show hosts will, from time to time, disagree publicly with the Republican president, the Republican Party, or some conservative doctrine. But these disagreements are strategically chosen to prove the host is an independent thinker without appreciably harming the president or the party. When the president's Republican, this is not to suggest that hosts don't genuinely disagree with conservatives at times. They do more often than you might think, but they usually keep it to themselves. If you lack compelling arguments in favor of your candidate or point of view, you attack the other side. And then a lot of discussion of Charlie Sykes as kind of the embodiment of this rote genre of right-wing talk radio.
Line, of course, is what he said. I'm afraid we have to wrap this up because Eric Adams informs me that a truckload of migrants is going to be occupying this ballroom.
That was good. And the other good Eric Adams line was, "I've never knew a vegan who liked turkey so much." That's my favorite. But
anyway, it was an unfortunate piece of timing for the Harris closing argument. Not that tens of millions of people are going to see the Al Smith thing, but I don't know. Those clips will go around wherever clips go around. I know that TikTok isn't really TikTok is not Trump's medium, but that stuff was perfect, right? It's like 15 seconds.
Also,
bits and bites.
This isn't really an important point, but I just want to mention it. I thought she's the joy candidate, right? And this is the event where it's like, we're not going to take ourselves seriously. We're going to have fun ribbing each other.
The joy is gone. The summer of joy has been replaced by the fall of fear.
And she's going to win, everybody. I've said it before.
But she issued that statement.
He's going to win, or she's going to win?
No, he's going to win. Trump's going to win.
Okay, I have no idea. I have no idea whether Trump is going to win.
I know it's close.
But I do think
he's going to win. He's winning.
Okay.
Trump's winning.
But I do. Mark Halperin thinks that Trump's winning, and Nate Silver's prediction machine has now moved from Trump having a 49.6% chance of winning to Trump having a 50.4% chance of winning. And so maybe he's going to win. I don't know. But I genuinely, I still don't know, because, you know, he is himself, and at any moment, he can get back to the person that people who are actually going to decide this election go, that was, I don't know about him, whatever. But he did knock it out of the park last night, and she's trying to tell you that he's senile. And meanwhile, Dana Carvey is going on SNL doing the greatest senility routine since Walter Matthau and the Sunshine Boys, and reminding people every day of, you know, not only what bullet they might have dodged, but also why is it exactly that Kamala? Okay, I'm pulling an audible and changing topics here has nothing to do. But like, why is it that she won't say what it is that she would do, or that what Biden did wrong? Can somebody? What is the political calculation that says?
Well, because she's still part. She's still part of the administration.
She needs his voters to turn out too. He still has some voters that she's struggling with, the people who still supported him and would have elected him whether he was, you know,
you are saying to me that there are Biden voters
in the Democratic Party. I think there still are, and she's struggling with them African American voters in particular. That there are some core turnout voters.
You think they would say, "I'm not voting for her because she was insulting to him"?
Well, I think they just wouldn't like the tone. I don't think they would like it.
So
I don't think it's disrespectful.
It has to do with Harris's personality, and she hates criticism, and she doesn't want to get any brushback from the Biden people if she strikes out on her own. And this also explains why she's so vague about everything. She doesn't want to take any definitive stands, because if she takes a definitive stand, it means that she's going to alienate people. And she's especially worried, as always, about alienating people on her left, because that's her milieu. That's the only environment in which she's operated, is coastal liberals. So it just comes down all the time to these extremely vague talking points that she just repeats. Who knows what's going on inside? but that's the public-facing Kamala Harris we get.
Well, and she also doesn't have to take responsibility. And I know I keep beating this dead horse for her role in continuing the ruse that he was capable of being the president.
Right. Okay. So I have a question about the logic of her position relating to herself and Biden and policy positions that she has taken. And again, maybe I'm like in galaxy brain mode here and being silly, because this is not the way ordinary people think. Not that I have a galaxy brain. I just mean that I'm in. So she says, I prosecuted transnational, all these positions that I took in 2019, I no longer hold effectively, right? She endorses Biden positions that are different from hers on fracking, on taxation, on various other things, right? She essentially says, those things that I said while I was running for president are no longer operative. I hew to the views as expressed by the Biden administration. And then she says, my values haven't changed. That is a deeply logical inconsistency, because I grant you that values are not the same as policies, but the policies that you adopt and suggest and advocate for.
It's the same thing as always. She's trying to have it both ways. Okay. My values haven't changed. I'm still a liberals, but I'm changing my policies because I need to win this election.
But she's
chasing the electorate.
Right. But policies are values. If there is one thing that defines being what we do here and what people who take politics
not if you're
seriously,
a cynical hack, John.
Right.
Right. If you're a cynical hack, you do whatever it takes to win the election. That's what
my values haven't changed. I've always loved guns. I have a camo hat. Every Thanksgiving, I make a turducken. I can't stop watching college football and NASCAR. My values haven't changed. Sure.
I still think that people think that values are expressed by policy.
Yeah, I think you're right, John.
I mean, that is not. I don't mean.
I'm not saying it's an effective strategy she's pursuing, but I think this is what she's attempting to do.
If you're in local politics and you take a view on zoning and then you change your view on zoning, right?
I mean, has there been this bad of a major party candidate in American presidential history? I can't recall a candidate as vapid and as empty